please, for her, for Hélène, for Mother." A strange tingling pulsed through my finger. I caught a whiff of something, not quite a feeling. Pushing my finger to the rune, I concentrated harder. I thought of Hélène, lying alone on a floor of woven boughs. I thought of her love for me. I thought of my love for her. The wood seemed to grow warmer under my fingertip. "Help her, please! She has given me so much." In a flash, I understood. The first rune spoke its meaning directly to my mind in a deep, resonant voice that I had never heard before, yet somehow had always known. "These words shall be read with love, or not read at all." Then came the rest, in a flowing, cascading river of words, a river that washed over me and carried me away. "The 7 songs of wizardry, 1 melody and many, may guide ye to the other world, though hope ye have not any." Excitedly now, rune by rune, I read my way up each step of the stairwell. Often I paused, repeating the words to myself before proceeding. When at last I reached the top, the sun's first rays were filtering down the stairwell and trembling over the runes. During the night, the 7 songs had been carved on the walls of my mind, just as they had once been carved on the walls of Arbasa. Chapter 11. 1 Melody and Many. I climbed the lost wooden stair and stepped through the curtain of leaves. My mother still lay on the floor, though no longer on the stretcher. Hearing me enter, she stirred beneath a light, silvery blanket woven from the threads of moths, and tried with effort to raise her head. Rhea sat cross-legged by her side, her face full of worry. Bumblebee, leaning against a far wall, looked glumly my way. "I have read the words," I announced without pride. "Now I must try to follow them." "Can you tell us a little?" whispered Hélène. The pink light of dawn sifting through the windows touched the pale skin of her cheeks. "How do they begin?" Grimly, I knelt by her side. I studied her face, so pained and yet so loving, and I recited. "The 7 songs of wizardry, 1 melody and many, may guide ye to the other world, though hope ye have not any." "Though hope ye have not any," repeated Bumblebee, staring blankly at his hat. "To-tro, to-tro, to-tro." As I glared at him, Rhea reached for a small pine-scented pillow. "What does it mean, 1 melody and many?" "I'm not sure." I watched her slide the pillow under my mother's head. "But it goes on to say that each of the 7 songs is part of what it calls the great and glorious Song of the Stars, so maybe it has something to do with that." "It does, my son," Hélène observed me for a moment. "What else did the words say?" "Many things," I sighed, "most of which I don't understand, about seedlings and circles and the hidden sources of magic, and something about the only difference between good magic and evil being the intention of the one who wields it." I took her hand. Then I came to the 7 songs themselves. They begin with a warning. "Divine the truth within each song before ye may proceed. For truths like trees for ages grow, yet each begins a seed." I paused, remembering that even the mighty Arbasa, in whose arms we now sat, began as a mere seed. Still, that gave me scant encouragement when I remembered the words that followed. Pursue the 7 songs in turn, the parts beget the whole. But never move until ye find each song's essential soul.
Each song's essential soul, repeated Rhea. What do you think that could mean?
I touched the woven boughs of the floor. I have no idea at all. My mother squeezed my hand weakly.
Tell us the songs themselves.
Still pondering Rhea's question, I recited. The lesson changing be the first, a treeling knows it well. The power binding be the next, as lake of face can tell. The skill protecting be the third, like dwarves who tunnel deep. The art of naming be the fourth, a secret slanters keep. The power leaping be the fifth, invarigal beware. Eliminating be the sixth, a sleeping dragon's lair. The gift of seeing be the last, forgotten island's spell. And now ye may attempt to find the otherworldly well. But lo, do not attempt the well until the songs are done, for dangers stalk your every step, with Baelor's eye but one. Silence fell over the room. Even Bumblewee's bells did not stir. At last I spoke in a hushed voice. I don't know how I can possibly do all the things the songs require and return here before I die. Hélène lifted her hand to my cheek. Is there any way I could persuade you not to go, my son? Her arm fell back to the floor. At least then we'd be together at the last. No, I'm the one who did this to you. I must try to find the cure, even if the chances are 1 in a million. Her face, already pale, grew still whiter. Even if it means your own death on top of mine. Rhea touched my shoulder in sympathy. Suddenly, a whoosh of wings stirred in my memory, and I thought of someone else I had lost, the brave hawk who had died in the fight for the shrouded castle. We had named him Trouble, and no name could have been more fitting, yet his actions rang even louder than his angry screeches in my ear. I wondered whether his spirit still lived in the other world, and whether, if I failed in this quest, I might join him there, along with my mother. Hélène stiffened, clenching her fists, as another spasm of pain coursed through her body. Rhea reached for a bowl of a yellow potion that smelled as rich as beef broth. Carefully, she helped my mother drink a few swallows, spilling a little on the floor. Then, raising the bowl, Rhea made a loud, chattering noise with her tongue. From on top of the cabinet, a squirrel with huge brown eyes suddenly bounced to the floor and loped to her side. It placed one paw on her thigh, waving its bushy tail. Almost before Rhea had chattered another command, the squirrel took the bowl from her hands. With a high-pitched chatter in reply, it bounded off, carrying the bowl in its teeth. "That's Ixtma," she explained to my mother. "I found him once in a glade near here, squealing from a broken leg. I set it for him, and since then he often visits, helping however he can. I asked him to refill the bowl for you, after he chopped some more chamomile." Despite her condition, my mother seemed on the verge of laughing. "You are an amazing girl, you are." Then her face tightened, the shadows of leaves quivering on her golden hair. "I only wish I had more time to know you." "You will," declared Rhea, "after we return with the cure." "We?" I looked at her in amazement. "Who said you were coming?" "I did," she replied calmly. She folded her arms across her chest. "And there is nothing you can do to change my mind." "No, Rhea, you could die." "Nevertheless, I'm coming." The floors and walls of the cottage creaked as our bossa swayed from side to side. I could not be sure whether a sudden wind outside had tossed its branches, but I suspected that the wind had sprung from within. "Why ever do you want to come?" I demanded. Rhea looked at me curiously.
"You get lost so easily."
"Stop that, will you? What about my mother? Someone needs to—"
"Ixtma will do it. We've already arranged everything."
I bit my lip. Turning to Hélène, I asked in exasperation, "Are all girls this stubborn?"
"No, just the ones with strong instincts."
Her eyes moved to Rhea.
"You remind me of me, child."
Rhea blushed.
"And you remind me of—"
Her voice trailed off.
"I'll tell you when we get back."
Bumblebee cleared his throat. "I shall stay." I jumped. "What?" "I said I'll stay, to keep her company during the excruciating agony of her death. It's going to be miserable, absolutely miserable, that I know for certain. But perhaps I can lighten her load a bit. I'll dust off my most cheery melodies, my most humorous tales. Just the thing for someone gripped by the horror of death." "You'll do no such thing." I struck the wooden floor with my fist. "You're coming with us." Bumblebee's dark eyes widened. "You want me to come?" "No, but you're coming anyway."
"Merlin, no."
Rhea waved her leaf-draped arms.
"Please don't let him come."
I shook my head gravely. "It's not that I want him with us. I want him away from her. What he calls humor could kill her in a week instead of a month." Hélène reached a trembling hand toward me and lightly brushed my scarred cheek.
"If you must go, I want you to hear what I have to say."
She locked her sapphire eyes on me, so that I could almost feel her gaze penetrating my skin.
"Most important, I want you to know that even if I should die before you return, it was worth it all to me just to see you again."
I turned away.
"And something else, my son. I have learned precious little in my time, but this I know. All of us, including me, have within ourselves both the wickedness of a serpent and the gentleness of a dove."
I pushed the hair off my brow. "I have a serpent, that's certain, but I'll never believe you do. Never." She sighed heavily, her eyes roaming the interwoven branches that framed the room.
"Let me say it in another way. You often enjoyed my tales of the ancient Greeks. Do you remember the one about the girl named Psyche?"
Puzzled, I gave a nod. Once more her blue eyes seemed to search me.
"Well, the Greek word Psyche has two different meanings. Sometimes it means butterfly, and other times it means soul."
"I don't understand."
"The butterfly is the master of transformation, you see. It can change from a mere worm into the most beautiful creature of all. And the soul, my son, can do the same."
I swallowed. "I'm sorry, Mother."
"Don't be sorry, my son. I love you. I love all of you."
Bending low, I kissed her hot brow. She gave me a faltering smile, then swung her head toward Rhea.
"And for you, child, I have this."
From the pocket of her deep blue robe, she pulled an amulet of twigs bound together with a red thread.
"An amulet of oak, ash, and thorn. Take it. You see how the buds are swelling with new life? They are ready to blossom, as are you. Keep it with you for courage. and remind you to trust your instincts. Listen to them, for they are really the voice of nature, mother of us all."
Rhea's eyes glistened as she took the gift and deftly fixed it to her shirt of woven vines.
"I will listen, I promise." "You already do, I think."
"It's true," I declared. "She has even been known to remind other people to trust in the berries." Rhea blushed, even as she fingered the amulet of oak, ash, and thorn. "Of course," muttered Bumblebee. "You have nothing for me." I scowled at him. "Why should she?"
"Oh, but I do," said Helene weakly. "I have a wish."
"A wish?" The lanky figure came closer and knelt upon the floor of branches. "For me?"
"I wish that one day you will make someone laugh."
Bumblebee bowed his head.
"Thank you, my lady." "Merlin," whispered my mother, "perhaps your 7 songs are like the 7 labors of Hercules. Do you remember them? They were thought to be impossible, yet he did them all, and survived."
Although I nodded, I felt no better, for Hercules' most difficult labor was to carry the weight of the entire world on his shoulders for a time, and the weight I bore now seemed no less than that. Part 2. Chapter 12. To Arthur. The bark-edged door creaked open, and I emerged from Arbasa. Before leaving the darkened stairwell, however, I took one last breath of the moist fragrance of the inner walls, and one last glance at the runes carved by Tuatha so long ago. I read again the words of warning that had haunted my thinking more than any others. "Pursue the 7 songs in turn, the parts beget the whole, but never move until ye find each song's essential soul." What could that final phrase mean? Each song's essential soul. It would be difficult enough just to make sense of the 7 songs, but to master the soul of each seemed utterly impossible. I had no idea even where to begin. Rhea stepped through the open door onto the grass. Her curly brown hair glowed from a ray of light piercing Arbasa's branches. She bent low and gently stroked one of the roots of the great tree. When she rose, her gaze met mine. "Are you sure you want to come?" I asked. She nodded, giving the root a final pat.
"It won't be easy, that's certain, but we have to try."
Listening to Bumblebee's jangling bells coming down the stairs, I shook my head. And with him along, it will be even harder. Rhea cocked her head toward the doorway.
"I'd rather hear a broken harp all day than listen to those bells. They remind me of an iron kettle rolling down a hillside."
I thought back to the lilting music of the flowering harp, music that had accompanied me for so many weeks. Rather than risk damaging it, I had decided to leave the harp behind, stowing it safely next to Rhea's hearth. Arbasa would guard it well, yet I knew that I would miss its melodic strains, and something more. I studied Rhea's face, as forlorn as my own. I should never have turned away from my task in the dark hills. I placed all of Finkyra at risk. Now I've done the same to my own mother. Grinding the base of my staff into the grass, I sighed. The truth is, I never deserved the harp. You saw me strutting around with it like some sort of wizard. Well, I'm no wizard, Rhea. I'm not powerful enough, not wise enough. Her eyebrow lifted slightly.
"I think you're already a little wiser."
"Not wise enough to master the souls of the songs. I don't even know where to begin." The massive boughs above our heads suddenly stirred. branches shook and clattered against one another, sending a shower of leaves and twigs to the ground. Although the smaller trees surrounding our Barca remained perfectly still, the great oak itself was swaying, as if caught in a fierce gale. A bolt of fear surged through me. I grabbed Rhea's arm. "Come, before a branch falls on us." "Nonsense," she wriggled free. "Our Barca would never do that. Just listen." As I shook the leaves from my hair, I realized that the snapping and swishing branches were indeed making another sound, a sound that repeated itself over and over. Tuatha, Tuatha. The swaying slowly diminished. The branches grew quiet. The majestic tree towered above us, just as it had before. Yet one thing had changed, for while I still knew nothing about the souls of the songs, I now had an idea where I might go to find out. "Tuatha's grave," I declared. "Our quest begins there." Rhea bit her lip. "If our Barca believes it might help, then I believe it too. But I don't like the idea of going there. Not at all." Just then Bumblebee, looking more pained than usual, poked his head out of the doorway in the trunk. He staggered onto the grass, clutching his belly. "What a storm that was! My tender stomach is turned inside out." The lanky fellow straightened himself, jostling the bells on his hat. "But fear not, no, fear not. Weather like that follows me everywhere, so I am quite used to it." Rhea and I traded worried glances. "I am still coming," he continued, rubbing his side. "Even though this new injury will make it more difficult to entertain you on the way, still a jester must do his best to try." He pulled his cloak over his head and started hopping around the roots of our Barca, his bells jangling in muffled bursts. I frowned. Better you try to entertain us than my mother. Bumblebee removed the cloak from his head. "Oh, don't worry about her," he said casually. "She still has plenty of time. She has almost a month of unremitting pain before she must die." He glanced thoughtfully at Rhea's aerial cottage. "If you like, I could go back up there and give her a few laughs before we leave." I raised my staff as if to strike him. "You fool! You have no more ability to make people laugh than a rotting corpse." He frowned with all of his chins. "Just you wait. I will make someone laugh one day. That I will." Lowering my staff, I said scornfully, "I can taste my boots already." The massive trunk of our Barca creaked as the doorway slid closed. I gazed at the trunk, following it higher, higher, until it disappeared in a mesh of branches above our heads. For a moment, I peered into the branches, woven like the threads of a living tapestry. Leaves glinted in the sun. Moss sprouted like fur under every bough. "Do you think," I asked Rhea, "that someday our Barca might open her door to me willingly, perhaps even gladly?" At my words, the entire tree shuddered, raining more leaves and broken bits of bark on us. Rhea's eyes narrowed. "Our Barca is being protective of me, that's all." I searched her grey-blue eyes. "You don't have to come." "I know." She pursed her lips in thought. "Are you sure, though, about going to Tuatha's grave?" Bumblebee gasped, wringing his hands. "The grave of the great wizard himself! Nobody goes there. Nobody who survives, that is. It is a haunted place. A terrible place. Too true, too true, too true." "We're going there," I snapped. "But I can't lead you," protested Rhea. "I don't even know where it lies." "I do. I have been there once before, maybe even twice, though I need to go there again to be sure. I rubbed the top of my staff, filling the air with the scent of hemlock. If you can guide us to that big swamp just below the misted hills, I can take us from there. She shook her curls doubtfully. We will lose precious time by doing this. Bumblebee shook his jangling head. We will lose more than that. So be it. I thumped my staff on the grass. Let's go. Rhea cast a longing glance at our boss's bows, then turned and strode across the grassy meadow, disappearing into a gap in the trees. I followed behind. Bumblebee took up the rear, grumbling to himself about haunted graves and vengeful wizards. For some time we followed a twisting trail marked by the prints of foxes, bears, and wolves, as well as others I could not identify. Then the trail vanished, and we struggled to cross a wide swath of fallen trees, downed by some ferocious storm. When, shins bruised and bleeding, we finally found our way back to standing groves of pine and cedar, Rhea led us to higher ground. There the spaces between the needled trees were greater, letting more shafts of light reach the forest floor. That helped my second sight, so at least I could avoid tripping over every root and jabbing against every branch. Even so, it was not easy to keep up with Rhea. Like me, she was driven by the urgency of our task, and perhaps by the tempting possibility of losing Bumblebee somewhere in the forest. But helped by his long, spindly legs, he managed to stay with us, rattling with every step. Meanwhile, Rhea loped along as gracefully as a deer, sometimes breaking into a quick run up a slope. Watching her reminded me of the Greek story about Atalanta, the girl who could run impossibly fast. Yet even as I grinned at the comparison, I frowned to think about the woman who had first told me the story. I pushed to keep up. Perspiration stung my sightless eyes. As the sun rode high above us, the land grew wetter. Moss sprouted from the sides of every tree, rivulets bubbled out of the ground, and mud clung to our boots. Dark pools of stagnant water appeared more frequently. It was the smell, not the sight, of this terrain that I recognized. Dank, rotting, and ominous, it dug into my memory like claws into flesh. Here, I announced, veering to the east. Rhea turned to follow me, stepping lightly through the mud, unlike Bumblebee, who skidded and stomped just behind. I led them to a shadowed glade of cedars. The sounds of the forest died away, succumbing to an eerie stillness. Not even the whir of a beetle's wings broke the silence. At the edge of the glade, I halted. With a backward glance, I told the others to remain where they were. Rhea started to speak, but I raised my hand to quiet her. Slowly, cautiously, I advanced alone. A sudden wind moved through, tossing the branches of the cedars. Instead of making their usual crackling sound, they vibrated strangely, as if they were singing a low, mournful dirge. A song of loss and longing, a song of death. The glade darkened until I could barely make out the shape of my boots on the needle-strewn soil. All around me, the wailing of the branches swelled. At last I entered a small clearing, surrounded by the circle of ancient cedars that I knew marked the grave of Tuatha. Slowly, very slowly, the clearing brightened. Yet the new light did not come from the sun. It came from the ancient cedars themselves, whose swaying branches had begun to glow with an ominous blue light. As the branches waved in the wind like the beards of old men, I wondered if those trees might hold the spirits of Tuatha's disciples, doomed to watch over his grave, ever mourning. Twice before, I now felt sure I had stood on this spot. Once, not long ago, and once as a small child, when I had been brought here on the back of my father's black horse, Ion, to witness the funeral of Tuatha. I remembered very little from that event, except the feeling of sorrow that permeated the glade. My gaze fell to the narrow earthen mound in the center of the clearing. 12 polished stones, perfectly round, bordered its rim. They gleamed like blue ice. As I drew a bit closer, I was struck by the sheer length of the mound. Either Tuatha had been buried with his hat on, or he had been very tall indeed.
"Both are true, you impudent young colt,"
The deep voice sounded in my ears. It was the same voice that I had heard while reading the runes in Arbasa. It was the voice I knew in my bones of Tuatha himself. Yet beyond my fear, beyond my dread, I felt a strange sense of longing. Training my mind on the burial mound, I gave words to my thoughts. "I wish I had known you, great wizard." The blue stones glowed brighter until they outshone the circle of ancient cedars. Candles seemed to flame within the stones, candles whose flames arose from the very spirit of Tuatha.
"You mean you wish I had saved you from your own folly?"
I shifted uneasily, scraping the ground with the base of my staff. "That too. Yet I also wish I had known you just to be with you, to learn from you."
"That chance was stolen from us," declared the voice bitterly. "And do you know why?"
"Because you were felled by the ogre Balor?"
"No,"
thundered Tuatha, making the stones light up like torches.
"You have answered how, not why."
I swallowed. I don't know why."
"Think harder then, or is your skull no less thick than your father's?"
My cheeks burned at the insult, yet I tried not to show my outrage. I furrowed my brow, probing my mind for the answer. Suddenly I remembered Caer Pray's words of warning at the gates of the town of the bards. Was it hubris?
"Yes,"
thundered Tuatha's spirit.
"It was my most grievous flaw, just as it is yours."
I bent my head, knowing too well the truth of his words. "Great wizard, I do not deserve your help, but Hélène does, and if I am to have any hope of saving her, I must know something." The stones flickered ominously.
"How do I know that you will not abandon her, even as you have abandoned the Dark Hills to the designs of Rita Gawa?"
I shuddered. "You have my word."
"The Great Council, too, had your word."
"I will not abandon her." My gaze swept the circle of cedars, who seemed to be shaking their branches disapprovingly. My voice barely a whisper, I added, "She means everything to me." For a long moment I heard nothing but the sighing branches. At last the blue stones glowed anew.
"All right then, fledgling. What is it you wish to know?"
Cautiously I stepped closer to the mound. "I need to know what it means to find the soul of a song." The stones flamed bright.
"Ah, the soul of a song. So little, yet so much. You see, young colt, as brief as the 7 songs you have read may seem, they reveal the secret well springs of the 7 basic arts of wizardry. Each song is but a beginning, a starting point, leading to wisdom and power beyond your imagination. Far beyond, I say. And each song holds so many verses that it would take several centuries to learn but a few."
"But what is the soul of a song?"
"Patience, you beardless infant!"
The stones seemed to smoulder. The soul is the song's essential truth, its first principle. To find it is as difficult as catching the scent of a wild flower from across a wide lake. You cannot see it or touch it, yet still you must know it.
I shook my head. That sounds difficult even for a wizard, let alone a boy. The branches waved more vigorously as the voice of Tuatha echoed again.
You may yet become a wizard, young colt. That is, if you survive. But remember this. As little time as you have, you will be tempted to pass over some of the songs. Resist such folly. Do not try to find the other world well until you have found the souls of all the songs. Heed well my words. Finding only 5 or 6 is no better than finding none. Without all 7, you shall lose more than your quest. You shall lose your very life.
I drew an uncertain breath. How will I know, great wizard? How will I know when I've found the soul of each song? At that instant, a tower of blue flame shot out of the stones. It sizzled and crackled through the air, striking the top of my staff like a bolt of blue lightning. I shook with the force of the blow, yet somehow I did not drop the staff. My fingers felt only slightly singed. The deep voice filled my ears again.
You will know.
I stroked the staff. It felt no different than before, yet somehow I knew that it was.
Now you must go, young colt. Remember what I have told you.
The light began to fade from the stones.
May you live to look upon my grave once again.
Please, I pleaded, tell me one thing more. Is the prophecy true that only a child of human blood can defeat Ritagawa or his servant Baylor? The glow did not return. I heard no sound but the mournful sighing of the branches. Tell me, please. At last the stones glimmered.
The prophecy may be true, and it may be false. Yet even if it is true, the truth often has more than one face. Now be gone, and do not come back until you are wiser than your years.
Chapter 13. Strange Bedfellows. As I emerged from the glade, the trees fell eerily silent again. I clung tight to my staff, aware that it, like myself, had been touched by the spirit of Tuatha, and that it, like myself, would never be quite the same. Rhea and Bumblebee came toward me as I stepped out of the cedars. Although they walked side by side, the contrast between them could not have been starker. One, who moved with the liveliness of a young fox, wore the greenery of the forest. The other, as stiff and glum as a tree stump, wore a heavy brown cloak and, of course, a hat of drooping bells. Yet both, at least for now, were my companions. Rhea reached for me, wrapping her forefinger around my own. "What did you learn?" I squeezed her finger. "A little. Only a little."
"That won't be enough," said Bumblebee. "Nothing is ever enough."
"Where do we go now?" asked Rhea, glancing at the darkened boughs behind me. Chewing on my lip, I pondered the first of the 7 songs. Well, I must somehow find the soul of the art of changing, and to do that, I need to find a treeling. The lesson, changing be the first, a treeling knows it well. I caught my breath. "But didn't you say that Kuen was the last of the treelings?"
She nodded, her face grim. I could tell that she felt even now the sting of Kuen's treachery.
She was the last, the very last, and she's most likely gone too. Probably bled to death after that goblin sliced off her arm.
I spun the staff's gnarled top in my hand. But then how can I find the soul of the song? It has something to do with the treelings. Rhea ran her hands through her curls.
You do have a taste for challenges, Merlin. Your only hope is to go to Forolana, the treelings' ancestral home. I don't think you will find much there, though.
How far is it?
Far. All the way to the southwestern tip of Finkyra. And we'll have to cross the full length of the Druma, which will slow us down more. The only way to avoid that would be to cut across the misted hills to the coast, then head south. But that means passing through the land of the living stones. Not a wise idea.
Bumblewee's head jangled in agreement.
Sound advice, young woman. The living stones have an uncanny appetite for travellers.
He gulped, wiggling his layered chins.
Especially jesters, I understand.
They must have strong stomachs, I added sardonically. Facing Rhea, I asked, That's the region where the Grandalusa lives, isn't it? Bumblebee shuddered.
Another excellent reason to avoid it. Even the living stones are afraid of that gargantuan spider. Her appetite is worse than theirs. Far worse.
I drew a deep breath of air, scented by the boughs surrounding us. All the same, Rhea, I want you to take us the shorter way, through the misted hills. Both the girl and the jester started. Even the silent cedars jostled their branches, seeming to gasp. Rhea leaned toward me.
Are you serious?
Completely. I pushed the hair off my brow. If we can save a day, or even an hour, it could be worth my mother's life. Bumblebee, his frowns carved deep into his face, grabbed the sleeve of my tunic.
You mustn't do this. Those hills are deadly.
I pulled free. If you would rather stay here with Tuatha, go right ahead. As his eyes opened to their widest, I struck my staff on the needle-strewn ground. Let's go. We left the shadowed glade, trekking through the marshy terrain. Except for the steady rattle of Bumblewee's bells, we moved in silence. At least, I thought grimly, the Grandalusa will hear us coming. But would we hear her? And would she hold back her appetite long enough to remember that she had once welcomed Rhea and me as guests in her crystal cave? My legs felt weak at the thought of her slavering jaws. As our feet squelched through the muddy soil, the trees thinned, and I noticed more landmarks. An odd, chair-shaped boulder, splotched with yellow lichen, the twisted skeleton of a dead tree, a patch of flaming orange moss, a strange triangular pit. In the deepening dusk, more water seeped into the soil, as well as our boots. Soon I heard frogs piping in the distance. Water birds joined the chorus, crying in eerie voices. The dank, rotting smell grew stronger. Before long, we arrived at the edge of a wide stretch of tall grasses, dead trees, and dark pools of quicksand. The swamp. Waving two mud-splattered sleeves, Bumblebee protested.
We're not going across that now, are we? It's almost nightfall.
Either we camp here, I replied, or find some drier ground in the hills. What do you think, Rhea? She pulled a handful of purple berries off a low bush and popped them into her mouth.
Still sweet.
Rhea.
Drier ground, she answered at last, though the berries here are tasty.
As the cry of a swamp crane echoed hauntingly from the shadows, Bumblebee shook his head.
A lovely choice. Spend the night in a swamp and get strangled by deadly snakes, or at the Grandalusa's doorstep and get eaten as her breakfast.
The choice is yours. I started off, leaping over a rotting log. I landed with a splash in a puddle, Seconds later, I heard 2 more splashes, along with bells and a lot of grumbling behind me. For a while I followed a strip of caked mud that pointed like a finger into the marsh. Yet that soon faded away, making it necessary to slog straight through the grassy pools. Sometimes I sank into water up to my thighs. Long, blackened fingers of submerged branches clutched at my tunic, while mud oozed into my boots, and every so often strange shapes stirred in the unknown depths. The light waned steadily. Tonight there would be no moon, however, for thick clouds had rolled in, obscuring the sky. Just as well, I told myself. Seeing the moon would remind me all the more of my vanishing time, as well as hope. We pushed on in the near darkness. After another hour of slogging and splashing, all light vanished. A snake hissed somewhere near my boot. I began to fear that we had somehow veered off course. The murk seemed to stretch on endlessly. My legs felt heavier and heavier. Then, little by little, the terrain began to grow more solid under my feet. At first I hardly noticed the change, but in time I could tell that we were climbing gradually onto rocky ground. The rotting pools disappeared, as did their smell. The cries of frogs and birds faded behind us. We had crossed the swamp. Exhausted, we stumbled into a level clearing surrounded by boulders. I declared it our camp for the night. In unison, we flopped down on the mossy ground. To warm my cold hands, I slid them into the opposite sleeves of my tunic. My eyes closed, and I fell asleep. I awoke when a large drop of rain splashed on my nose. Another drop came, and another. A cloud on the horizon flashed suddenly with light, and thunder rumbled over the ridge. The downpour began. Rain pelted us, driven by the rising wind. The night sky grew even darker, as if the clouds had condensed into great slabs of rock. Waves of water poured down from the sky. Even if I could somehow have changed into a fish, I'd have been no wetter. All I needed now was gills. Shivering from the cold, I moved closer to one of the boulders, hoping to find at least a little shelter. That was when I realized that the boulder was moving closer to me.
"Living stones!" cried Rhea. "We've got to get—"
"Hey!" screamed Bumblebee. "It's eating me!"
I tried to roll away from the boulder, yet the shoulder of my tunic was caught, holding me fast. I tugged on it, trying to break loose. As water streamed down my face, I pounded my fist against the stone. My fist hit the wet rock, and stuck there. It wouldn't budge. Then, to my horror, the rock started closing around it, swallowing my whole hand with lips of stone. I shrieked, but a clap of thunder drowned out my voice. In the blackness, in the torrent, I fought with all my strength to pull free. Soon the stone had consumed my whole hand, then my wrist, my forearm, my elbow. Hard as I kicked and squirmed, I could not get away. Though I could still feel my fingers and hand, the pressure on them was increasing steadily. In no time my bones would disintegrate, crushed in the jaws of a living stone. A sudden flash of lightning brightened the ridge. In that instant, a huge, hulking figure, broader than the boulders themselves, entered the clearing. Its voice, louder even than the thunder, rose above the storm.
"Hungry!" bellowed the great beast. "I am hungry!"
"The Grandilusa!" shouted Rhea.
Bumblebee screamed again, the scream of a man about to die. In a single leap, the Grandilusa landed at my side, her 8 legs splattering mud in all directions. Despite the rain and the darkness, my second sight could not miss her massive jaws opening. As I glimpsed the endless rows of jagged teeth, I struggled all the harder to escape. The jaws closed. Not on me! With a terrific crunch, the Grandilusa took an enormous bite out of the living stone itself. The boulder shuddered violently, then released my arm. I tumbled backward onto muddy ground. Before I knew what was happening, someone fell on top of me as a blast of white light seared the ridge. Chapter 14. The Crystal Cave. Light, sparkling like stars, danced all around me, and around Rhea and Bumblebee as well, for we lay in a single heap of arms and legs and torn clothing. I pushed someone's dripping foot out of my face and sat up. Aside from being soaking wet and feeling intensely sore in my hand, I was fine, wherever I might be. In a flash, I recognized the rows upon rows of glowing crystals, the shimmering waves of light that vibrated over the walls, and the sheer magnificence of this place. Thousands upon thousands of dazzling facets, each as smooth as ice, glittered on all sides, shining with a light of their own. The Crystal Cave. On my first visit here, I had known that I had never been anywhere as beautiful. Now, I knew it again. Something cracked behind me. I swung my head around to see the Grandilusa herself, her body so vast that it nearly filled the entire glowing cavern. She had just taken a bite of what looked like the hindquarters of a wild boar. Her huge eyes, faceted like crystals themselves, observed me as she chewed. After swallowing the last morsel, she licked her arms clean with surprising delicacy.
"Welcome to my cave," she bellowed.
Bumblebee, his bells jingling as he shivered, clutched my sleeve in terror.
Are we next?"
"Of course not," chided Rhea, her damp curls sparkling like the crystals around us. "She brought us here to get us away from the living stones."
So she could eat us herself,"
stuttered the jester.
"Silence!"
The gargantuan spider scratched the white hump on her back.
"I have satisfied my hunger for now. Lucky for you, living stones take some time to digest. The boar was merely dessert."
Using the sleeve of my tunic, I wiped the raindrops off my face. "Thank you, but how did you get us here so fast?"
"Leaping."
The Grandilusa edged a bit closer, so that I could see myself reflected dozens of times in the facets of her eyes.
"It is an art you may learn one day."
"Leaping is one of the 7 songs I have to master. Don't tell me I need to learn how to do what you just did. Well, that alone could take a lifetime."
"Many lifetimes."
The great white spider continued to examine me.
"Especially for one who cannot complete his tasks. Where have you left the flowering harp?"
Perspiration beaded on my brow. "It's safe, in Arbasa, but I can't go back to the Dark Hills now. I have another problem to solve first."
"A problem you caused?"
I lowered my head. "Yes."
"A problem?"
thundered the creature.
"That you can still solve?"
Slowly, I raised my head. "Are you saying I might really have some chance to save her?" One of her enormous legs tapped against the floor of crystals.
"A minuscule chance is still a chance."
Rhea crawled a little nearer to me. "So Elaine might survive?"
"She might, and her young man might as well."
As the Grandilusa cleared her throat, the rumble echoed between the curving crystalline walls.
"But he will need to survive this quest, and many more, before he may one day find his own crystal cave.
My own crystal cave? My heart leapt at the idea. Is that really possible?
Anything is possible.
The immense spider slid her bulk to one side, revealing an array of glittering objects. The treasures of Vinkyra. I recognized the orb of fire, its orange sphere aglow like the crystals, the graceful horn I knew to be the caller of dreams, and the great sword deeper cut, with one edge that could slice all the way into the soul, and another edge that could heal any wound. Just behind them, I glimpsed the plough that could till its own field, the treasure that Horn had described to his son. Near it lay the rest of the wise tools, except for the one that had been lost.
It is even possible that one day you may be wise enough to carry one of the treasures and not destroy more than you create.
I swallowed hard.
You may tell me the 7 songs.
Not a request, but a command. Her words boomed in my ears. I hesitated for an instant, then sucked in my breath and began. The 7 songs of wizardry, one melody and many, may guide ye to the other world, though hope ye have not any. Bumblebee, who was huddled at the far end of the cavern, shook his head morosely, clanging his bells. The spider turned an enormous eye on him, and he instantly stopped. In the glow of the crystals, I continued, reciting the warning to master each of the songs in turn. Rhea's bright eyes sparkled like crystals themselves when I spoke the words that were now embedded in my very being. Each song's essential soul. Then I moved through the 7 songs themselves. When, at the conclusion, I mentioned the Eye of Balor, the Grondalusa shifted her weight uneasily on the faceted floor. No one spoke for some time. At last the Grondalusa's voice rang out.
Are you afraid?
Yes, I whispered. I am afraid I can't do it all in 4 phases of the moon.
Is that all?
I'm afraid of how hard it will be to find the souls of the songs.
Is that all?
I ran my hand nervously across the crystalline floor, feeling the sharp edges. I'm afraid of the 7th one, seeing, most of all. But I don't know why.
You shall find out why, if you get that far.
Using 3 of her arms, she scratched her hairy back.
You may learn a little magic as well. It is a pity you won't learn anything really useful, though. Like how to spin a web, or how to chew a stone.
Rhea giggled, then her face grew taut. What does it mean, the part about Balor's eye? The spider's white hairs bristled.
The ogre has only one eye, and it kills anyone who looks into it, even for an instant.
Rhea leaned toward me. That must be how Tuatha died.
Yes, indeed,
declared the Grondalusa.
And how you too will die, if you are not careful.
I frowned. The truth is, I may never get past the first song. When you found us, we were trekking to Far Olana in the hope of learning something that might help. But with no treelings left, it is hardly a hope at all.
It is the only hope you have.
Far Olana is so far away from here, said Rhea despairingly. It's a good week's walk, even if we don't run into any more trouble. "A week," I groaned. "We don't have that much time to spare." A sudden explosion of white light filled the crystal cave. Chapter 15. Changing. We found ourselves sitting on a grassy field at the edge of a sheer cliff that dropped straight to the sea. As I peered over the edge, I viewed colonies of kittiwakes and silver-winged terns nesting on the cliff wall, screeching and chattering and tending to their young. A cool breeze smacked my face. The smell of salt water seasoned the air. Far below me, the white line of surf melted into bright blue and then into green as dark as jade. Across a wide channel of water, I could barely make out the shape of a small island, dark and mysterious. Behind it billowed the wall of mist that surrounded all of Finkyra. I turned to Rhea and Bumblebee, also investigating our new surroundings. To think that we had, only seconds before, been inside the Grandaluce's crystal cave. Wherever we were now, it was far away from there. Such a wondrous skill to move people like that. She had even remembered to send along my staff. I made a mental note to pay close attention to the 5th lesson, leaping, should I ever make it that far. Rhea bounced to her feet. "Look there," she cried, pointing toward the small island. "Do you see it?" I stood, leaning against my staff. That island out there, yes. Looks almost unreal, doesn't it? Rhea continued to stare. "That's because it is almost unreal. That's the Forgotten Island. I'm sure of it." A shiver shook my spine. The 7th song. That's where I must go to learn about seeing. I glanced at her briefly before turning back to the island, shrouded by shifting vapors. "Have you seen it before?" "No." "Well, then how can you be so sure it's the Forgotten Island?" "Our boss's stories, of course. It's the only piece of land in all of Finkyra that's not connected to the main island. Not one, not even Darkda himself, it is said, has set foot there for ages. And except for the mer people who live in this inlet, no one knows how to cross the powerful currents, and even more powerful enchantments that swirl around it all the time." I dodged a gull that swooped just in front of my face. Yet I couldn't take my gaze from the island. Sounds like people aren't supposed to go there. My stomach churned uneasily. For whatever reason. She sighed, still watching the island herself. "Some people believe it has something to do with how Finkyrans lost their wings long ago."
"To-tro, to-tro, to-tro," intoned Bumblebee as he walked mopily toward us, jangling with every step. "That was the saddest moment in the whole sorry history of our people."
Was it possible that the dour jester knew how the wings were lost? I felt suddenly hopeful. "Do you know how it happened?" His long face swung toward me.
"No one knows that. No one."
I frowned. Ayla, the Wind Sister, knew, but she hadn't wanted to tell me. I wished I could ask her again. Yet that was impossible as catching the wind. More than likely, she had blown all the way to Gunid by now. Rhea turned at last from the island. "Would you like to know where we are standing right now?" I gave her a nudge. "You still sound like a guide." "You still need a guide," she answered with a half grin. "We're in Far Olana, the strip of land that was once home to the Treelings." Listening to the surging waves below us, I scanned the plateau. Steep, cream-colored cliffs bounded us on 3 sides. But for a few piles of crumbling stones, possibly all that remained of walls or hearths, nothing but grass covered the plateau. Far to the north, a line of dark green marked the edge of a forest. Beyond that, the horizon lifted in a purplish haze, possibly all that was visible of the misted hills. A dingy brown butterfly fluttered out of the grass and landed on my wrist. Its legs tickled, so I shook my hand. Then it flew off, landing on the knotted top of my staff. its motionless wings blended into the deeper brown of the wood. With a sweep of my arm, I indicated the grassy plateau. I don't see how we're ever going to learn about the treeling's art of changing. If they ever lived here, they didn't leave much behind.
That was their way.
Rhea picked up a white pebble and tossed it over the cliff.
The treelings were wanderers, always searching for some place better to live. Some place to sink roots, like true trees, and call home. Their only settlements were here by the cliffs, but as you can tell from those rock piles, they weren't much. Nothing more than shelters for the very old and the very young. No libraries or markets or meeting halls. Most treelings spent their days wandering across Vinkyra, only coming back here when they were ready to find a mate or to die.
So what happened to them?
They got so caught up in their exploring, I guess, that fewer and fewer of them ever bothered to come home. Eventually, nobody at all returned. The settlements fell apart or blew away, since there was nobody around to take care of them, and the treelings themselves died off, one by one.
I kicked at a tuft of grass. I can't blame them for wandering. It's in my blood, too. But it sounds as if they never felt at home anywhere. Rhea studied me thoughtfully, the wind off the water ruffling her leafy garb.
And is feeling at home somewhere in your blood, as you say?
I hope so, but I'm not sure. What about you? She stiffened.
Harbossa is my home, my family, all the family I've ever had.
Except for Kuwen. She bit her lip.
Once she belonged to my family, but no more. She gave that up for a sackful of goblin promises.
The butterfly lifted off from my staff. It flew over to Bumblebee, who was still gazing glumly across the channel at the forgotten island. Just before landing, the butterfly apparently changed its mind and returned to the gnarled shaft of hemlock. I watched its dull brown wings, one of which was badly frayed, slowly opening and closing. Looking again at Rhea, I declared, "We must find her."
Who?
Kuwen. She might be able to tell me what those piles of stones cannot. Rhea made a face as if she had eaten a handful of sour berries.
Then we are lost. There is no way to find her, even if she did survive losing her arm. Besides, if we did find her, we couldn't trust her.
Fairly spitting the words, she added,
"She's a traitor, through and through."
Below us, an enormous wave crashed against the cliff, sending the kittiwakes and terns screeching from the spray. Even so, I have to try. Surely somebody saw her after she left. If treelings are all that rare nowadays, the sight of one would be noticed, wouldn't it? She shook her head.
You don't understand. Treelings not only weren't satisfied to stay in any one place, they weren't satisfied to stay in any one body either.
You don't mean...
Yes. They knew how to change form. You know the way most trees change their colors in the autumn and take on a whole new garb in the spring? The treelings went far beyond that. They were always swapping their tree-like shape for a bear or an eagle or a frog. That's why they were named in the song about changing. They were masters of it.
My hopes, already as fragile as the butterfly perched on my staff, vanished entirely. So Kuwen, if she's still alive, could look like anything.
Anything at all.
Bumblebee, sensing my despair, spoke up.
I could sing you a song if you like, something light and cheery.
Since I didn't have the strength to protest, he started to sing, swaying his bell-draped hat in time to the rhythm.
Life's unending curse, it could be far worse. Yet I'm full of glee, none gladder than me. Though death fills the air, I do not despair. It could be far worse, life's unending curse. Be merry, you see, far worse it could be. So much worse than now. Just don't ask me how.
Stop! Shouted Rhea. If you really feel that way, why don't you just jump off this cliff and put an end to your misery? Bumblebee frowned triply.
Weren't you listening? That's a joyous song. One of my favourites.
He sighed.
Oh dear, I must have botched the delivery. As usual. Here, I'll try it again.
No! A voice cried out. But the voice did not belong to Rhea, nor to me. It belonged to the butterfly. With a frantic fluttering, the tiny creature left its perch, rose into the air, and started spinning downward. Just before it hit the grass, a loud crack split the air. The butterfly vanished. In its place stood a slim, gnarled figure, part tree and part woman. Her hair, as rough as straw, fell over the bark-like skin of her face, framing two dark eyes the shape of teardrops. A brown robe encircled her, covering her body down to her broad, knobby feet that resembled roots. Only one arm protruded from the robe, its hand wearing a silver ring on the smallest of 6 fingers. The sweet scent of apple blossoms clung to her, in stark contrast to the sour expression on her face. Rhea stood as stiff as a dead branch. "Cooin." "Yes," whispered the treeling, her voice rustling like dry grass. "It is Cooin. The same Cooin who took care of you as a baby and nursed you through many a sickness. And who tried to give me to the goblins." Cooin's lone hand ran through her ragged hair. "That wasn't my desire. They promised they would not harm you. You should have known they would lie. No one can trust a warrior goblin." She stared at the twisted figure. "Now no one can trust you. Don't you see I know that?" A kittiwake landed on the grass nearby and started tugging at some strands with its beak. Though the bird pulled vigorously, the grass wouldn't budge. "Watch this," said Cooin, taking a small step closer. In her most gentle voice she asked, "If I tried to help you build your nest, good bird, would you let me?" The kittiwake screeched and flapped its wings angrily at her. Only after carrying on for some time did it finally settle down and return to work, still watching Cooin warily with one eye. Sadly, the treeling turned back to Rhea. "You see, this is my punishment. You deserve it, every bit. I am miserable, totally miserable. I thought things could get no worse. Then suddenly you appeared." She aimed a knobby finger at Bumblebee. "With this voice of doom." The jester raised his head hopefully.
Perhaps you prefer riddles. I know a terrific one about bells.
"No!" shrieked the treeling. "Please, Rhea, I am so full of remorse. Won't you forgive me?" She crossed her leaf-covered arms. "Never." I felt a strange pang. The word never rang in my ears like a heavy door slammed and barred. To my own surprise, a feeling of sympathy rose inside of me. Certainly Cooin had done something terrible, something she regretted. But hadn't I also done things I deeply regretted? I stepped close to Rhea, lowering my voice. "It's hard, I know. Yet maybe you should forgive her." She stared at me coldly. How can I? The same way my mother forgave me after what I did to her. At that instant, Elaine's parting words came back to me. The butterfly can change from a mere worm to the most beautiful creature of all. And the soul, my son, can do the same. I bit my lower lip. Kuan did something awful, to be sure. But she deserves another chance, Rhea. Why? Because, well, she could change. All of us, all living things, have the potential to change. Suddenly my staff flashed with bright blue light. The wooden shaft sizzled as if it were burning. A split second later, both the light and the sound disappeared. As I twirled the staff in my hand, I found a marking, as blue as the sky at dusk, engraved upon the shaft. It was in the shape of a butterfly. I knew, in that moment, that Tuatha's spirit still touched my staff, and that, somehow, I had discovered the soul of changing. Hesitantly, Rhea stretched her hand toward the treeling. Kuan, her slender eyes glistening, took it in her own. For a moment they regarded each other in silence. Finally the treeling turned to me. "Is there any way I can thank you?" "Seeing you two like this is thanks enough." "Are you sure there is nothing I can do?" "Not unless you know the power of leaping," I replied. "We must go now to the Lake of the Face, far to the north."
10 days' walk, moaned Bumblebee. No, more like 12. No, make it 14.
Kuan's teardrop eyes probed me. "I don't know the skill of leaping, but the skill of changing may be useful to you." Rhea caught her breath. "Oh, Kuan, if only we could swim like fish." "It would save you several days." I jumped. "Is it really possible?" A crooked grin spread over Kuan's face as she wiggled her bony fingers at Bumblebee. "You, voice of doom, will go first."
No,
he pleaded, backing away.
You wouldn't. You couldn't.
"Sleepna, sleepna, Hanaway swish," intoned Kuan. "Kelpono, bublem, tublem, fish." All of a sudden, Bumblebee halted, realizing that he had backed up almost to the edge of the cliff. He looked down at the crashing surf, his eyes wide with fright, his sleeves flapping in the wind. He looked back at Kuan, and his eyes grew wider still.
Please,
he stammered.
I hate fish. So slimy, so very wet all over. So...
Crack! An ungainly fish, with enormous eyes and quadruple chins under its downturned mouth, flopped helplessly on the grass before finally plunging over the cliff. Yet I found it hard to laugh, for I knew I would be next. Chapter 16. Liquid Thrill. Suddenly I couldn't breathe. Wind rushed past. I fell down, down, down. I fought to take in some air. No use. The howling wind tore at me, yet I could not fill my lungs with it, as I had always done before. Then, with a splash, I hit cold water. My gills opened wide. Gills! I breathed again at last. As water moved around me, it also moved through me. No more arms, no more legs. My body was now a single streamlined tail with flexible fins above and below and on both sides. One of the fins curled around a small stick, which I guessed was all that remained of my staff. What had happened to my satchel, boots, and tunic I had no idea. It took me a moment to find my balance, for whenever I tried to move my fins, I flipped over on my side. And it took more than a moment for my second sight to adjust to the dim, scattered underwater light. Except for the layer of water closest to the surface, there was practically no light at all. Only gradations of darkness. After several minutes of struggling, however, my confidence began to improve. I discovered that swimming required completely different movements than it had with my human form. Stroking was out of the question. So was kicking, at least in the old way. What I needed to do was sway my entire body from side to side, like a living whip cracking. Every single scale on my skin, from my gills to the tip of my tail, joined in the motion. Soon I found I could whip through the waves, and I could move up or down as well as left or right. A slender fish, mottled with greens and browns, swam over. I knew at once it was Rhea, for although she had been underwater no longer than I, she moved with the grace of the current itself. We waved our fins in greeting. She made some sort of coughing sound, and I realized that she was laughing at the sight of my miniature staff. At that moment, Bumblebee, trailing a torn ribbon of kelp from his tail, swam slowly toward us. While he wore no bells, there was no mistaking him. From the front, his sagging chins made him look like an eel wearing a ruffled collar. It was the closest he had ever come to being funny, although he had no idea. Our first task was learning to keep together. Rhea and I took turns in the lead position, with Bumblebee always following behind. In time, Rhea and I began to swim with increasing coordination. A sixth sense slowly emerged in us, the same sense that binds an entire school of fish together. After the first full day of swimming, the two of us moved almost as a single, connected being. A quiet, liquid thrill moved through me as we swam through vast forests of swaying kelp or leapt through the rolling waves. I could taste feelings as well as flavors in the currents. I could sense the joy of a family of dolphins, the lonely struggle of a migrating turtle, the hunger of a newborn sea anemone. Yet I never forgot the seriousness of my quest. Even as I reveled in the experience of being a creature of the water, I knew that all of this was merely a means of saving time, and perhaps Helene. Still, I promised myself that if I ever survived this quest and one day actually became a wizard, perhaps even the mentor of a young king or queen, I would remember the virtues of transforming my student into a fish. One of those virtues was discovering the great amount of food that the sea could provide. Why, the sea was really one enormous, floating feast. Day after day, I ate enough insects, eggs, and worms to feel bloated. Rhea, for her part, proved adept at catching tasty little crayfish. While Bumblebee drew the line at worms, even he tasted many of the sea's strange delicacies. At the same time, we tried to stay alert to the danger of becoming someone else's delicacy. Once, I swam through a tunnel of bright yellow coral, only to find a very large, very hungry fish waiting for me at the other end. As quickly as I darted away, I surely would have been caught but for the even larger creature who suddenly appeared, scaring off my pursuer. Although I just barely glimpsed the creature who had helped me, it seemed to possess the tail of a fish and the upper body of a man. For 6 days and 5 nights we swam steadily northward. Often, after dark, the pale light of a swelling half-moon danced upon the waves. Yet the moon's beauty escaped me. I saw in its face only the face of someone else, someone I feared losing forever. Less than 3 weeks remained. At last came the moment when Rhea veered sharply toward the coast. She led us to a small delta where a freshwater stream emptied into the sea. I could taste, mixing with the salty flavors of the wide waters, the purity of melted snow, the playfulness of otters, and the unwavering patience of a stand of ancient spruce trees. We surged up the stream as far as we could. Then, concentrating my thoughts, I repeated the command that I had learned from Kuen. All of a sudden I stood knee-deep in a tumbling cascade, clutching my staff in one hand and Rhea's arm in the other. Just downstream, Bumblebee threw himself on the marshy bank, coughing and sputtering. He had, it seemed, forgotten that people tend not to breathe too well with their heads under water. While Bumblebee recovered, Rhea and I shook some of the water from our clothes and ourselves. Meanwhile, she explained that she believed that this stream flowed down from the lake of the face itself. Before long, all three of us were trekking along the stony stream bank, climbing with the rising ground. A tangled forest of alder and birch that clung to the bank made the going difficult. Every time Bumblebee tried to shake free of the branches that grasped at his cloak, his bells rattled soggily. At one point I paused, panting hard from the climb. Spying a shaggy-topped mushroom growing among the roots of a birch, I pulled it from the ground. "Strange as it sounds," I said as I took a bite, "I'm going to miss those little white worms." Rhea wiped her brow and grinned at me. She picked her own mushroom. "Maybe you'll find more worms at the Lake of the Face." "How did it come to have such a name, do you know?" She chewed pensively. "Some say it's from the shape, which is a little like a man's face. Others say it's from the power of the water." "What power?" "If you look into it, according to legend, you will face an important truth about your life. Even if it's a truth, you would rather not know." Chapter 17. Binding. We continued on, following the stony stream bank as it climbed through the alders. Though roots tripped our feet and thorns tore our clothing, our pace hardly slackened. Several hours and scraped shins later, the waterway opened into a snug valley surrounded by steep wooded hills. The spicy scent of pine trees wafted over us. Amidst the trees, outcroppings of white quartz gleamed in the late afternoon sun. Yet the valley seemed eerily silent. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered, no bees buzzed. I listened closely, hoping to hear the stirring of something alive. Rhea, reading my thoughts, gave a knowing nod. "Animals and birds stay away from this valley. No one knows why."
"They're smarter than people,"
observed Bumblebee, still dripping water from his bells. I watched Rhea walk down to the shore of the lake in the center of the valley. The lake, its water almost black, was so still that hardly a ripple broke its surface. Its contours resembled, from this angle, the profile of a man whose jaw, strong and defiant, jutted outward, much like my own father's. Remembering him, I stiffened. I wished he had been as strong in reality as in appearance. Strong enough to stand up to Rita Gower when he had seen the chance. Strong enough to help his own wife, Hélène, when she had needed him. A shriek jolted me out of my thoughts. There, by the edge of the lake, stood Rhea, gazing into the dark water. She held her hands in front of her protectively, while her back arched in fear. Yet if something in the lake had frightened her, she made no effort to move or get away. She stared straight into the water, completely transfixed. I ran down to her. Bumblebee followed me, alternately tripping over his torn cloak and the mesh of vines that grew along the shore. Just as I reached her, she turned around. Her skin, usually full of color, looked deathly pale. She gasped when she saw me, as if she were suddenly afraid. Then she shuddered and grabbed my arm for support. I braced myself to support her weight. "Are you all right?" "No," she answered weakly. "Did you see something in the lake?" "Yes." She shook herself again, releasing my arm. "And you'd better not look."
"Fine," declared Bumblebee, glancing nervously at the dark water. "Let's go."
"Wait." I stepped to the edge of the lake. As I peered into the still water, I viewed my own reflection, so clear that for an instant I thought that my own twin was in the lake, staring back at me. What, I wondered, could have been so frightening about such a perfect reflection? There were my useless eyes, looking like lumps of coal beneath my brows, and my scarred cheeks, ravaged by flames that I could still almost feel. Stroking my cheeks, I wished that I might someday grow a beard to cover those scars. A beard, curly and white, like the one I imagined that Tuatha himself had worn. I jumped back. The boy in the lake started sprouting whiskers. First black, then grey, then white as the quartz on the hillside. The whiskers grew long and scraggly. They covered most of the boy's face, growing and growing. Soon they fell all the way to his knees. Was it possible? Was the lake of the face telling me that I would one day, like him, be a wizard? I smiled, feeling increasingly confident about peering into the still, dark water. Whatever Rhea had seen had clearly departed. I leaned closer. The boy in the lake, no longer wearing a beard, slowly turned away from me. He ran towards something. No, someone. A huge, muscular warrior, wearing a red band around his forehead, strode out of the depths. Then, as the warrior came nearer, I realized that he had only one eye. One enormous, wrathful eye. Balor. To my horror, the ogre dodged the boy with ease, grabbed him by the throat, and lifted him high. My own throat constricted as I watched the boy being strangled by powerful hands. Hard as I tried, I could not turn away from the terrifying scene. The boy struggled wildly, trying not to look in the ogre's deadly eye. Yet the eye's power pulled on him. Finally, he succumbed. With a last jerk of his legs, he hung limp in the ogre's hands. I fell backward on the ground, gasping for air. My head whirled, my neck throbbed. With each breath I coughed uncontrollably. Rhea reached for me, as did Bumblebee. She squeezed my hand while he patted my brow sympathetically. Slowly my coughing subsided. But before any of us could speak, someone called to us across the water.
"So,"
wheezed a gleeful voice,
"are you finding the lake's prophecies difficult to, shall we say, swallow?"
A full, breathy laughter followed.
Are you just feeling, shall we say, choked up?
Regaining my bearings, I scanned the dark surface of the lake. Near what would be the nose of the profile, I spotted an immense, hairy otter, silver in color, except for his face, which was white. He floated leisurely on his back, kicking so effortlessly that he hardly caused a ripple. I pointed. There, an otter. Rhea shook her head in disbelief. I didn't think anyone lived here.
"I only live where I oughter,"
he answered merrily, squirting a jet of water from between his two front teeth.
"Care to join me for a swim?"
No chance,
declared Bumblebee. He waved his long sleeves like fins, causing his bells to dribble water on his face.
I've had enough swimming for a lifetime.
"Then perhaps I should sing one of my water songs for you."
The otter kicked lazily toward us, patting his belly with both paws.
"I have, shall we say, a fluid voice?"
His breathy laughter came again, echoing over the lake. Supporting myself with my staff, I stood. "No thanks. The only song we care about isn't about water." Seized by a sudden inspiration, I asked, "You wouldn't happen to know anything about the magic of binding, would you?" Rhea frowned. "Merlin," she cautioned. "You don't know him at all. He could be—"
"An expert in matters of binding,"
said the otter, relaxedly.
"My favorite pastime, next to floating on my back and watching the clouds, that is."
"You see," I whispered to her, "he could tell us what we need. And I don't see anyone else around this lake who might be able to help. I don't trust him." "Why not?" She pressed her tongue against her cheek. "I don't know exactly. It's just a feeling. An instinct. Oh, confound your instincts. We're running out of time. I searched the shoreline for any sign of other creatures who could perhaps assist us. There were none. Why would he lie to us? We have no reason to mistrust him. But, I growled with impatience, what now? She hissed at me like a snake. Well, confound it all, Merlin. I can't put it into words. Then I'm going with what I think, not what you feel. And I think that any creature who lives in this enchanted lake all alone must have some special knowledge, maybe even special power. I turned back to the otter, who had drifted much closer. I need to find the soul, the first principle of the art of binding. Will you help me, good otter? Tilting his head toward the shore, he squirted a jet of water at me.
Why should I?
Because I asked you, that's why. He blew some bubbles in the water.
Oh, that tickles my ears.
More bubbles.
You need to give me a better reason than that.
I jammed my staff into the soil. Because my mother's life is at stake. He said lazily.
Your mother? Well, I had a mother once myself. She was a terribly slow swimmer. Oh, well, I suppose I could help you. Only with the fundamentals, though.
My heart pounded in my chest. That's what I need.
Then pull up some of those vines.
He floated closer to the shore.
By your feet.
Vines?
Of course,
replied the otter, kicking in a slow circle.
To learn about binding, you need to bind something. Go do it, boy. I haven't got all afternoon. Get your smiling friends to help you.
I turned to Rhea, who was still frowning, and Bumblebee, who had never stopped. Will you give me a hand? Reluctantly, they agreed. The vines, though supple, were thick and heavy, covered with rows of tiny thorns. Hard to grasp, hard to lift. Pulling them up was difficult work. Untangling them from one another was worse. At last we succeeded. Several lengths of vine, each 3 or 4 times my height, lay at my feet. Bumblebee, exhausted, sat down with a loud clang, his back to the water. Rhea stayed by my side, watching the otter warily. I straightened my back, feeling terribly sore in the place between my shoulder blades. Clearly all the pulling had strained something. We've done it, now what? The otter continued swimming in a circle.
Now tie one around your legs, tight as you possibly can.
Merlin, Rhea warned. She touched a lens amulet of oak, ash, and thorn, still attached to her leafy shirt. Ignoring her, I sat down and wrapped one of the vines around my ankles, calves, and thighs. Despite the thorns, I managed to tie it with a triple knot.
Good,
sighed the otter with a yawn.
Now do the same thing to your arms.
My arms?
Do you want to learn about binding or not?
I turned to Rhea. Help me, will you? I don't want to. Please, we're losing precious time. She shrugged. All right, but it feels all wrong. The otter, his fur glistening, clucked with satisfaction as he watched Rhea tie my hands together, then bind them to my chest.
Good. You're almost there.
I hope so, I replied testily. These thorns are digging into my skin.
Just one more vine. You are, shall we say, bound to be pleased?
The otter put one paw in the water and splashed Bumblebee.
You there, lazy fellow! Wrap one around his whole body. Make sure you cover all the places we've missed so far. Even his head. This is, after all, a delicate enchantment we're talking about. Everything must be exactly right.
Bumblebee glanced at me.
Should I?
I gritted my teeth. Do it. Somberly, Bumblebee wrapped me up as tight as a cocoon. When he had finished, only my mouth and part of one ear remained exposed. I lay on my side on the soil, unable to move, ready at last to learn the soul of binding. My jaw held closed, I asked, "What now?" The otter wheezed a little laugh. "Now that you are, shall we say, wrapped with attention, I will give you the information you asked for." "Make it quick." A vine dug into my hip. I tried to roll to the other side, but couldn't even begin to budge. "Please." "The first principle of binding, as with anything, is—" He blew a fountain of water into the air. "Never trust a trickster." What? The otter laughed uncontrollably, clutching his ample belly as he rolled over and over in the shallows. "That's why they call me the trickster of the lake." Still laughing, he kicked lazily toward the far shore. "Hope I didn't, shall we say, tie you up too long?" I shrieked with anger, yet I could do no more. However long it had taken to tie me up with the vines, it seemed to take twice as long to untie me. By the time I stood, pacing the shoreline in frustration, the sun had almost disappeared behind the rim of hills. "I've wasted the whole day," I moaned, tender from the scrapes on my hands, hip, and forehead. "The whole day! I can't believe I trusted him." Rhea said nothing, though I knew her thoughts well enough. I swung around to face her. "You should never have come with me. You should have stayed back at Arbasa, where at least you'd be safe." Her grey-blue eyes examined me. "I don't want to be safe. I want to be with you." I squashed a vine under my heel. Why bother? "Because I want to." She glanced sadly at the dark water. "Despite what the lake told me." "What did it tell you?" She sighed heavily. "I don't want to talk about it." Remembering my own vision of Balor's eye, I nodded. "All right, but I still don't know why you want to stay." Something in the sky caught her attention, and Rhea looked up. Following her gaze, I found two distant shapes weaving their way across the horizon. Although I could barely see them, I knew at once what they were. A pair of hawks riding the breeze together. They flew almost as one, bobbing and turning in unison, in the way Rhea and I had moved as fishes. "Aren't they lovely?" she asked, her eyes following the birds. "If they are like the hawks in the Truma, they not only fly together, they build a nest together, a nest they share for their whole lives." All at once I understood. What tied the hawks to each other, what tied Rhea to me, had nothing to do with vines, or ropes, or chains of any kind. I turned back to her. "I guess, Rhea, the strongest bonds are invisible. Maybe the strongest bonds are of the heart." With a flash of blue, my staff ignited. As the flame disappeared, I discovered a new marking engraved on the shaft, not far from the butterfly. It was a pair of hawks, bound together, in flight. Chapter 18. Light Flyer. The blue light had barely faded from my staff before my thoughts turned to the third song, that of protecting. I turned from the lake, its smooth surface gleaming darkly, to the forested valley surrounding us. Crossing the steep, thickly wooded ridge would be only the beginning, for the third song would require yet another long voyage. The skill protecting be the third, like dwarves who tunnel deep. To the land of the dwarves. Their realm, Rhea explained, was visited only rarely, and almost never by choice. For the dwarves, while peaceful to their neighbors, did not welcome any intruders. All that was known about their underground realm was that its entrances lay somewhere near the origins of the river Unceasing, on the high plains north of the misted hills. This time we had no choice in how to get to our destination. We would have to walk. Even pushing ourselves each day until long past sunset, it took the better part of a week to work our way over the hills. Our meals consisted mainly of wild apples, crescent nuts, a sweet vine that Rhea discovered, and the occasional egg or two from an unwary grouse's nest. While we avoided any more encounters with living stones, the trekking proved arduous. Vapors swirled constantly, wrapping us in misty shoals, inhibiting our views from even the higher ground. During one swamp crossing, Rhea lost one of her shoes in a pit of quicksand. We spent much of that afternoon searching for a rowan tree so that she could weave a replacement from its leathery bark. 2 days later, we crossed a high pass, slick with ice and snow, but only after walking the entire night of the full moon. Finally, bedraggled and exhausted, we came to the high plains of the river's headwaters. Countless star-shaped yellow flowers blanketed the plains, filling the air with a tangy scent. In time we reached the rushing river Unceasing itself. There we encountered a pair of cream-colored unicorns grazing along its banks. Heading north, we followed the river's serpentine path up a series of wide, alpine meadows that ascended like bright green stairs. As Rhea reached the edge of one of these meadows, she stopped, pointing at the line of snowy mountains in the distance.
"Look, Merlin. Behind those peaks lies the city of the giants, Varigel. I've always wanted to see it, even now that it's only a ruin. Albasa says it's the most ancient settlement on Vinkyra."
Too bad dwarves, not giants, are our goal. I bent down, pulling up a handful of fluffy-tipped grass. Giants will have to wait for the 5th song, the one that involves Varigel somehow, if we make it that far.
This audiobook has been broken into multiple parts to make the download faster. You have reached the end of a part, but not the end of the complete audiobook. So please check your library for the next part of this audiobook.
Listening Library presents The 7 Songs of Merlin, Book 2 of The Lost Years of Merlin by T.A. Barron. Read for you by Kevin Isola. As we continued trekking after sunset, a gleaming disk emerged from the layers of clouds. Clipped along one edge, the moon was now waning. I pushed harder, practically running along the grassy bank, knowing full well that more than half of my time had vanished, and I had unraveled only 2 of the mysterious songs. How could I possibly complete the remaining 5, climb up to the other world, obtain the elixir, and return to Elen all in less than 2 weeks? Not even a real wizard could hope to do so much. By the glow of the moon, we scrambled over yet another steep rise, grasping at the roots and shrubs to keep from tumbling over backward. The river Unceasing, now only a splashing stream, flowed down the slope beside us, its little falls and pools sparkling in the silver light. At last we topped the rise. Before us stretched an enormous moonlit meadow, split by the shining ribbon of water. Bumblebee fell in a jangling heap by the stream.
"I can go no further without rest, and also food. A jester needs his strength."
Panting in the night air, I leaned against my staff. "It is your audience who needs strength."
"Too true, too true, too true."
He mopped his brow with the edge of his heavy cloak.
"On top of everything else, I am baking to death. This cloak has me perspiring even after the sun goes down. And during these hot days we've been enduring, it's sheer torture."
Perplexed, I shook my head. "Then why don't you leave it behind?"
"Because without it I may freeze, turn to ice. Why, it could snow any time, this hour, this minute, This second.
Rhea and I traded amused glances. Then she bent down and sniffed the star-shaped flowers. Grinning, she picked a fistful of stems, rolled them into a compact yellow mass, then handed the roll to me. "Taste it," she implored. "The astral flower is a trekker's sustenance. It is said that lost travelers have lived on nothing else for many weeks." Biting into the roll of flowers, I tasted a sweet yet sharp flavor, almost like burned honey. You know who would like this? Our old friend Shim. "Yes," replied Rhea. "Or as he would say, certainly, definitely, absolutely." She handed a fresh roll to Bumblebee, sprawled on his back by the stream. "Shim loved honey as much as I do. Even before he grew into a giant, he ate enough honey for one." With a sigh, she added, "I wonder whether we'll ever see him again." Kneeling, I placed my cupped hands into the shimmering water. As I brought the water to my face, however, the moon's wavering reflection appeared within my hands. I jerked backward, drenching my tunic. "Did you see something?" Rhea studied me with concern. "Only a reminder of all the damage I've done." She considered me for another moment. Then, in a voice so soft I could barely hear it above the splashing stream, she spoke. "You still have the heart of a wizard." My hand slapped the water, splattering us both. "Then give me the simple heart of a boy. Rhea, whenever I tap into those yearnings, those powers, those arts of wizardry, I do something terrible. Because of me, my mother lies at the edge of death. Because of me, much of the Dark Hills remains a waste, just waiting for Rita Gower and his warrior goblins to return. And because of me, my own eyes are blind and useless." Bumblebee propped himself up on one elbow, clanging his bells.
"Such despair, my boy. Could I offer my assistance? Allow me to tell you the riddle about the—"
"No!" I shouted, waving him away. I turned back to Rhea. "The truth is, Domnu is a thieving old hag, but she had it right. I could be the worst disaster ever to come to Finkyra." Rhea said nothing and bent to take a drink from the stream. As she raised her head, she wiped the water from her chin. "No," she declared at last. "I don't think so. It's not anything I can put my finger on. It's more the berries. I mean, the harp actually did work for you, at least for a while. The speaking shell, too, did your bidding." All I did was find the right shell. Then it used its own power to bring my mother here. "Even if you're right, what about Tuatha? He wouldn't have allowed you to read the 7 songs unless there was at least some chance you could master them and travel to the other world." My head drooped. Tuatha was a great wizard, a real wizard. And he did tell me someday I might become one too. Yet even wizards make mistakes. No, the only way I'll travel to the other world is when I die. And by then my mother will have died as well. She hooked her finger, still wet from the stream, around my own. "There's still the prophecy, Merlin, that only a child of human blood can defeat Rita Gower and those who serve him." Turning away, I gazed at the wide meadow beyond the stream. Though some of its grasses glimmered in the moonlight, most of the meadow lay shrouded by shadows. Somewhere out there, I knew, lay the realm of the dwarves, and somewhere beyond that lay the secret entrance to the world of the spirits, guarded by the ogre Balor. I pulled my hand away. "That prophecy, Rhea, is worth no more than the person it refers to. Besides, I only want to save my own mother, not battle the warriors of Rita Gower." Reaching for a pebble, I tossed it into the silvery stream. And I doubt I can even do that.
"Ah, misery,"
intoned Bumblebee, his face as shadowed as the meadow.
"At last you see the wisdom in what I have been telling you all along."
I bristled. "Nothing you have told me remotely resembles wisdom."
"Don't be offended, please. I'm only pointing out that there is only one thing left for you to do." give up.
My cheeks burned. Seizing my staff, I stood up. That, you poor excuse for a jester, is the one thing I shall not do. I may be certain to fail in this quest, but I will not fail out of cowardice. My mother deserves better than that. Casting a glance at the moonlit meadow before us, I spoke to Rhea. Come if you like. The dwarves' realm cannot be far from here. She drew a long breath. Yes, but it would be foolish to try to find it now. We need a few hours' rest, and Merlin, that meadow, it's full of danger. I can feel it. On top of that, the dwarves' tunnels are surely hidden by the land, if not by magic. They will be hard enough to find even by day.
Just give up,
urged Bumblebee, reaching for some more astral flowers. Never, I growled. Pivoting on the walking stick, I turned to go. Don't, Merlin. Rhea stretched her arms toward me. Ignore him. Wait for daylight. You could easily get lost. If I could have breathed fire, I would have. You wait for daylight. I can take care of myself. I strode into the meadow, the tall grasses swishing against my tunic. Moonlight streaked the land like luminous claw marks, yet most of it lay shadowed. Then, several paces ahead, my second sight detected an unusually dark patch. Since no rock or tree stood near enough to cast a shadow, I realized that it might be a tunnel, or at least a pit. Not so foolish as to walk right into such a thing, I angled to the left. Suddenly, the earth beneath my feet gave way. I plunged downward. Before I could even cry out, total blackness swallowed me. When I awoke, I found myself curled into a tight ball, covered with a heavy blanket that reeked of smoke. Something was carrying me, grunting constantly, though I had no idea what form of beast it was, or where it was taking me. Thick ropes bound my arms and legs, while a wad of cloth filled my mouth. But for the muffled grunts beneath me, I heard no sound but the beating of my own heart. Jostled and bounced like a sack of grain, I felt increasingly dazed and bruised. My torture seemed to last for hours. Finally, the jostling came to an abrupt halt. I was heaved onto a floor of smooth, hard stone. I lay there, face down, my head spinning. The blanket was ripped away. With great effort, I rolled over. An assembly of dwarves, each one no taller than my waist, stared at me with eyes redder than flame. Most wore tangled beards, while all bore jeweled daggers on their waists. Standing beneath a row of sizzling torches, with feet firmly planted and burly arms crossed on their chests, they looked as immovable as the rock walls surrounding them. One, whose beard showed streaks of grey, straightened his back stiffly, leading me to guess that he had been one of the grunting dwarves who had carried me here.
"Cut his bonds!"
commanded a sharp voice. Immediately, strong hands rolled me over again and sliced through the ropes. Someone pulled the wad of cloth out of my mouth. Working my stiff arms and parched tongue, I managed to sit up. Spying my staff on the floor beside me, I reached for it. A dwarf lifted his heavy boot and stomped on my wrist. I shouted in pain, my cry echoing within the rock walls.
"Not so fast!"
It was the same sharp voice. This time, though, I located its source. A thick-set dwarf seated on a throne carved of jade, inlaid with rows of gems, which rested on the ledge above the stone floor. She had unruly red hair, pale skin, and earrings of dangling shells that clinked whenever she moved. Her oversized nose looked nearly as big as Shim's before he became a giant. She wore a black robe embroidered with runes in geometric shapes sewn in glistening gold thread, plus a peaked hat to match. In one hand she held a staff almost as tall as my own. As I started to stand, the dwarf raised her free hand.
"Do not try to get up. You shall be low, lower than me. And do not reach again for your staff."
She leaned toward me, clinking her white shell earrings.
A staff be dangerous, you know, even in the hands of an upstart enchanter like you, Merlin.
I caught my breath. How do you know my name? She scratched her prominent nose.
No one knows your true name, not even you, it be clear.
You called me Merlin.
Yes,
she said with a snorting laugh that seemed to make the torches flame brighter in the cavern.
And you may call me Urnalda, but neither be a true name.
Furrowing my brow in bewilderment, I tried again. How did you know to call me Merlin?
Ah,
the white shells clinked as she nodded.
That be a better question.
She raised a stubby finger to touch an earring.
The shells told me, just as a shell told you a few things, some that you be too headstrong to hear.
I shifted my weight on the hard stone floor.
Not only that, you be an intruder.
Urnalda waved her arms, sending their shadows racing across the walls.
And I do so despise intruders.
At this, several of the dwarves reached for their jeweled daggers. One, whose forehead showed a jagged scar, chortled loudly. The sound hovered in the air of the underground room. Stroking her staff, Urnalda considered me for a long moment.
Even so, I might yet choose to help you.
Truly? I glanced at the dwarves, who groaned in disappointment. Then, recalling my experience with the trickster of the lake, I felt suddenly suspicious. Why might you help me? She snorted.
Because one day, if you be successful, you might wear a hat such as mine.
Not comprehending, I examined her peak hat more closely. Its point slouched to one side. Lower down, dozens of tiny holes pierced its surface, allowing Urnalda's red hairs to poke through. But for the silver embroidery, which might have been more attractive if it showed stars and planets instead of runes, it was quite simply the most ridiculous hat I had ever encountered. Why would I ever want a hat like that? The dwarf's eyes narrowed, as if she could read my thoughts. In a deeper voice than usual, she declared,
This be the hat of an enchanter.
I winced. I didn't mean to insult you.
That be a lie.
All right, then. I am sorry I insulted you.
That be true.
Please, will you help me? Urnalda tapped thoughtfully on her staff before finally uttering a one-word answer.
Yes.
A black-bearded dwarf, standing beside her throne, grumbled angrily. In a flash, she turned on him and raised her hand as if to strike. He froze, petrified. Slowly, she dropped her hand, even as his beard dropped right off his face. He squealed, covering his naked cheeks with his hands. Meanwhile, other dwarves hooted and guffawed, pointing at the fallen beard on the floor.
Silence!
Urnalda shook herself angrily, jostling the shell earrings, as well as the throne on the ledge.
That will teach you to doubt my decisions.
She turned back to me.
I will help you because you might yet defy all and survive. Maybe even live to become an enchanter yourself.
Slyly, she squinted at me.
And if I help you now, you might one day help me.
I will. I promise I will. The torches sizzled, wavering, making the rock walls themselves appear to vibrate. Urnalda leaned forward, her shadow enlarging on the chiseled surface behind her.
Promises be serious things.
I know. I gazed at her solemnly. If you help me find the soul of protecting, I will not forget. Urnalda snapped her fingers.
Bring me a light flyer and the carving stone with hammer and chisel.
Still wary of some sort of trick, I asked, What is a light flyer? Be still!
But for the sizzling of torches, silence filled the cavern. For several minutes, no one stirred. Then heavy boots clomped into the underground room as a pair of dwarves approached the throne. One of them hunched under a huge black stone, as rough as the walls themselves, that must have weighed twice as much as he did. At a nod from Ronaldo, he lowered his shoulders and dropped the stone with a thud on the floor. The second dwarf bore a hammer and chisel in one hand and some sort of small, glowing object in the other. It seemed to be an upside-down cup made of clear crystal, resting with its rim against his palm. Within the crystal, an unsteady light flickered. At Ronaldo's nod, he set the tools by the stone. Then he carefully placed the cup on the floor, taking care to slide his hand away quickly so that something inside it would not escape. Ronaldo gave a snorting laugh, and the torches flamed brighter.
Inside that crystal cage be a light flyer, one of Finkyra's rarest creatures.
She grinned crookedly at me, a look I did not like.
Your next song be protecting, be it not? To learn what you need to know, you must find the best possible way to protect the light flyer from harm.
Observing the hammer and chisel, I swallowed hard. You mean carve a cage? From that big stone? She scratched her nose pensively.
If that be the best way to protect the fragile little creature, then that be what you must do.
But that could take days, or weeks.
It took dwarves many years to carve the tunnels and halls of our realm.
I don't have that much time.
Silence!
She pointed her staff at a hole in the ceiling, which glowed with a subdued light of its own.
That tunnel, like the one you fell down, provides us with air as well as light. There be hundreds of them, each one carved as smooth as the floor you be seated on, each one concealed on the surface by enchantment. That be why dwarves stay so well protected. That be why you came here to learn the soul of the song.
Are you sure there is no other way? I protested. The earrings swayed from side to side.
There be no other way to learn the lesson yourself. Your task be to protect the little creature from harm. Now begin.
With a final clink of her shells, Ronaldo left the room, followed by her entourage. I gazed at the sizzling torches on the walls, watching the shadows cast by her throne grow, then shrink, then grow again. That very throne, like the walls themselves, had been hewn from unforgiving stone, the same stone that the dwarves, over centuries, had moulded into an entire realm. And now it was my turn to mould stone. Chapter 19. Protecting. The hammer and chisel gleamed coldly in the wavering light of the torches. Grasping the tools, I regained my feet and approached the massive black stone. It came almost to my waist. I raised the hammer and struck my first blow. My hand, my arm, my whole chest shook. Before the ringing of the hammer died away, I struck a second blow, then a third. Time passed as I worked, but without its usual rhythms, for in the subterranean throne room of Ronaldo, the only sign of day or night came from the air tunnel in the ceiling above my head, while by night its circular mouth gleamed with the silver light of the moon. By day it glowed bright with the golden light of the sun. Yet day or night made no difference to me. The torches on the walls sizzled constantly. I hammered incessantly, on the flat top of the chisel, on the black stone directly, and occasionally on my poor swollen thumb. The hammer rang to the rhythm of my own breathing. Chips flew into the air, and sometimes my face. Yet I continued, stopping only long enough to eat some of the thick, smoky porridge provided by the dwarves.
or to nap fitfully on the blanket. 3 bearded dwarves guarded me at all times. One stood over my staff on the stone floor, his burly arms folded on his chest. In addition to his dagger, a double-sided axe hung from his belt. The other 2, holding tall spears fitted with blades of blood-red stone, positioned themselves at either side of the entry tunnel. All wore the same grim expressions, which only deepened whenever Urnalda herself entered the hall. She sat upon her throne on the ledge, for hours it seemed, watching me work. She seemed lost in thought, despite the constant banging of the hammer in my blistered hands. Or perhaps she was trying to probe my innermost thoughts. I did not know, and did not care. All I knew was that I would not, as Bumblebee had suggested, give up. When I thought of his proposal, or of my mother's condition, sparks flew from the stone. Yet I felt increasingly aware of the limits of my time, and of my ability as a stone carver. The glow from the light flyer flickered and wavered, playing on the black stone as I worked. Bit by bit, more pieces of the stone chipped away. In time I had made a shallow groove. If my thumb and aching arms held out, into a hollow large enough to invert and cover the light flyer. How much more time that would require I could not tell. Judging from the shifting light in the air tunnel overhead, 2 days and nights had already passed. Throughout my labor I kept hearing in my mind Urnalda's final command. Your task be to protect the little creature from harm. Once in a while, as the hammering continued, I wondered whether there was a clue buried in those words. Could there be some other way to keep the light flyer safe? Some way I was missing? No, I told myself, that couldn't be. Urnalda herself had credited tunnels of stone with keeping the dwarves safe. While even stone will not last forever, it is stronger than anything else. The message was clear. I must build a cage of stone, just as the dwarves built this underground realm. I have no choice. Still, as I hammered and pried, trying to split the stone along its cracks, I wished there were some easier way. Like the way I had wielded the great sword Deepercut in the battle of the shrouded castle. I had not used my hands, but some hidden powers of my mind to make the sword fly through the air. Somehow, in that moment, without knowing how, I had tapped into the magic of leaping, just as the Grandalusa had done, sending us to the abandoned land of the Treelings. Could I possibly tap into that same power again? Could I make the hammer and chisel do my work now, thereby sparing my stiff back, sore arms, and blistered thumb?
Be not a fool, Merlin.
I looked up from the stone to face Urnalda, watching me from her jade throne. What do you mean?
I mean, be not a fool. If, indeed, you made Deepercut fly to you, it be less because of you than because of something else. That sword be a treasure of Finkyra. It be possessed of its own powers.
She leaned forward on her jade throne, clinking her earrings.
You did not wield the sword as much as it wielded you.
I dropped the hammer, which clanged on the stone floor. How can you say that? I did it. I used the sword with my own power, just as I... Urnalda smacked.
Finish your sentence.
My voice fell to a whisper. Just as I used the flowering harp.
Exactly.
The torches wavered as she examined me, scratching her bulbous nose.
You be a slow learner, but there may yet be hope for you.
I have a feeling you're talking about more than my skill with stone. She snorted, straightening her hat.
Of course. I be talking about your skill at seeing. No wonder that, of all the 7 songs, you fear that one the most.
I blanched. Before I could say anything, she declared,
You be a slow learner with stone, too. You would never succeed as a dwarf in the tunnels, which be why I doubt the prophecy can turn out to be true.
What prophecy?
that you will one day rebuild a great stone circle, as great as Stonehenge.
I sputtered like one of the torches. Me? Rebuild something of that size? That's likely. Just as likely as I will pick up a Stonehenge, stone by stone, and move it across the ocean to Goonid. Her red eyes gleamed strangely.
Oh, it be prophesied that you will do that, too. Not to Goonid, but to a neighboring land called Logres, or Gramarye by some. But that prophecy be even less likely than the other one.
Enough, I declared. I blew on my blistered palm, then reached again for the hammer. Now I've got to get back to my real work, carving a stone cage as you commanded me to do.
That be a lie.
My hammer raised, I froze. A lie? Why? Shadows skipped around the room as her earrings clattered softly.
I commanded you, Merlin, yet that be not my command.
You gave me this stone.
That be true.
You told me to protect the light flyer from harm.
That be true.
And that means carving something stronger than that crystal cup over there.
That be your decision, not mine.
Slowly, hesitantly, I lowered the hammer. I set it down along with the chisel and moved closer to the crystal. The creature within it trembled like a tiny flame. May I ask you a question, Ronalda, about the light flyer?
Ask.
I watched the wavering light of the crystal. You said it's one of the rarest creatures in Finkyra. How does it survive? How does it stay safe? Ronalda's face, lit by the torches, showed the hint of a crooked grin.
It be safe by roaming in the bright sunlight where it cannot be seen, or at night by dancing in the places where moonbeams meet water.
In other words, by being free. The shell earrings clinked gently, but she said nothing. I reached to touch the crystal cup. Spreading my fingers over its glowing surface, I felt the warmth of the creature caught inside. With a sudden flick of my wrist, I turned the cup over. A shimmering spot of light, no bigger than an apple seed, floated into the air of the cavernous hall. I heard only a faint hum as it rose past my head. The light flyer lifted swiftly to the ceiling, slipped into the mouth of the air tunnel, and was gone. Ronalda pounded with her fist on the arm of her throne. The two dwarves guarding the entrance instantly lowered their spears, aiming the blades straight at me. Again she pounded.
Tell me why you did that.
I drew a halting breath. Well, because even a cage of stone will eventually crumble. The best way to protect something is to set it free. At that instant, blue flame erupted from my staff. The dwarf standing over it yelped and leapt his own height into the air. Even before he fell back to the floor, I could make out the new marking etched in blue on my staff. It was a cracked stone. Chapter 20. Rivers Cool and Warm. By the time I found the others at their camp by the headwaters, not far from where I had left them, we had been separated more than 3 full days. The meadow grasses, painted several shades of green, rippled in the breeze. Seeing me approach, Rhea ran to meet me. Her worried face relaxed as soon as she glimpsed the third marking etched on my staff. She touched my hand. I was so worried, Merlin. My throat tightened. With good reason, I'm afraid. You told me I might get lost, and I guess I did. You found your way back, though? Yes, I replied, but it took me too long. 10 days, no more, remain. Bumblebee joined us, almost tripping on his cloak as he hopped over the splashing stream. Although he wore his usual stack of frowns, he seemed genuinely glad to see me. He clasped my hand and shook it vigorously, jangling his bells in my ears. Then, sensing that he was about to try again to tell his famous riddle of the bells, I turned and walked away briskly. Both he and Rhea followed. Before long we had put some distance between ourselves and the realm of the dwarves, yet far more distance lay ahead. For the fourth song, Naming, had something to do with the Slantos, a mysterious people who lived at the extreme northeastern tip of Finkyra. While to get there we would not need to climb any more snowbound passes, we would have to cross the entire breadth of the rusted plains. That alone would take several days. Then we would be hard-pressed to find a route past the sheer cliffs of Eagle's Canyon, not to mention the northern reaches of the Dark Hills. And while I knew that danger lurked in all these places, it was the notion of crossing the Dark Hills that left me most unsettled. To cross the plains, we rose each day at dawn, when the first morning birds and the last evening frog sang together in chorus. We stopped only occasionally to pick berries or roots, and once, thanks to Rhea's ability to speak the buzzing language of bees, to eat a bit of honeycomb, dripping with sweet syrup. She also seemed to know just where we might find water, leading us to hidden springs and quiet pools. It was as if she could somehow see into the landscape's secret mind, as easily as she could see into my own. The moon offered enough light to trek into the night, so trek by moonlight we did, across the sweeping plains. Yet the moon, like our time, was quickly disappearing. Finally, after 3 long days, we reached the edge of Eagle's Canyon. We sat on the rocky rim, gazing out over the broad stripes of red, brown, maroon, and pink that lined the cliffs and buttresses. Gleaming white pinnacles protruded from the opposite wall. Far below, a shallow river snaked along the base of the cliffs. Tired though I was, I couldn't help feeling a rush of strength when I recalled the stirring cry of the canyon eagle that had marked the beginning of the great council of Finkyra. If only I could soar like an eagle myself! I could sail over this colourful gorge as swiftly as the wind, just as I had done ages ago, it seemed, on Trouble's feathered back. But an eagle or a hawk I was not. Like Rhea and Bumblebee, I would have to descend into the canyon by foot and find some route up the other side. With my second sight, I followed the line of cliffs, searching for some way to cross. We were, at least, far enough north that the walls were not completely impassable. Farther to the south, they lifted into a yawning chasm that sliced through the very center of the Dark Hills. Rhea, the most sure-footed of the 3 of us, led the way. She soon discovered a series of narrow ledges that crisscrossed the cliff walls. By following each ledge until we found a place to drop down to the one just below, we gradually moved lower into the canyon, sometimes sliding on our backs, sometimes climbing over crumbly outcroppings. Finally, soaked with perspiration, we reached the bottom. The river, though muddy, was much cooler than we were. Bumblebee, sweltering under his thick cloak, plunged straight in. Rhea and I followed suit, kneeling on the round stones that lined the river bottom, soaking our heads and rinsing our arms, splashing water on each other. Once, though I could not be certain, I thought I heard the distant screech of an eagle from somewhere above us on the cliffs. At last, feeling refreshed, we began the arduous climb out of the canyon. Before long, I needed to use both hands and thrust my staff into the belt of my tunic. As the slope grew steeper, Bumblebee's grumbling grew worse. Yet he struggled to keep up, climbing just below Rhea, finding his handholds in the footholds she had just vacated. As we scaled a particularly steep buttress, my shoulders ached from the strain. I leaned back as far as I dared without losing my grip, hoping to glimpse the top of the canyon wall. But I found only more layered maroon and brown cliffs rising above us. Glancing below, I viewed the muddy river, which seemed no more than a thin trickle on the canyon floor. I shuddered, tightening my grip on the rock. For as little as I wanted to climb upward, I wanted even less to tumble so far downward. Rhea, who was slightly to my left on the buttress, suddenly called out, "Look! A Shah! On the pink rock there!" Careful not to lose my balance, I turned to find a light brown, kitten-like animal basking in the sunshine. Like a cat, it lay curled in a little ball, purring quietly. Unlike a cat, it had a pointed snout lined with soft whiskers and 2 paper-thin wings folded across its back. The delicate wings fluttered with every purr.
"Isn't it lovely?" asked Rhea, gripping the wall of stone. "Shahs are found only in high rocky places like this. I've seen only one before, from much farther away. They're very shy."
Hearing her voice, the Shah opened its blue eyes. It tensed, watching her intently. Then it seemed to relax. The purring resumed. Slowly, Rhea shifted her footholds. Then, grasping the crumbling cliff with one hand, she reached toward the creature. "Careful," I warned. "You might fall."
"Shh! You'll frighten it."
The Shah shifted slightly, placing its furry paws on the rock as if it were preparing to stand. Each of the paws had 4 little toes. As Rhea's hand came nearer to its face, the Shah's purring grew louder. Just then, I noticed something strange about the paws. At first, I couldn't identify what it was. For some reason, they seemed a bit odd. All of a sudden, I knew. The toes were webbed, like the feet of a duck. Now, why would a creature of the high rocky canyons have webbed feet? In a flash, I understood. "Don't, Rhea! It's a shifting wraith!" Even as I started to shout, however, the Shah began to transform. Quick as lightning, the wings evaporated, the blue eyes reddened, the fur became scales, and the cat's body changed into a serpent with dagger-like teeth. The air crackled as it threw off a brittle, transparent skin, like a snake that is shedding. All this happened in the blink of an eye. Hearing my shout, Rhea had barely enough time to duck before the serpentine creature, jaws wide open, leapt at her face, claws extended. With a savage scream, the attacker flew just over her head, plunging into the canyon far below. Although its jaws missed her, the shifting wraith's tail whipped against her cheek. Thrown off balance, she lost her footing. For an instant she clung to the buttress with one hand, swaying precariously. Then the stone crumbled. She fell, right on top of Bumblebee. Clinging tight to the rock face, his fingers turning white, the lanky jester howled at the impact. Yet somehow he held on, managing to break Rhea's fall. Still, she was left hanging upside down on his back, struggling to right herself. "Hold on, Bumblebee!" I cried, watching them from above.
"I'm doing my best," he groaned. "No, that's never good enough."
Suddenly, the stone supporting his hands broke loose, splitting into shards that clattered down the cliff. The 2 of them screamed in unison, arms and legs flailing. They slid down the rock face, striking a narrow ledge that stopped their fall. There they hung, high above the canyon floor. Like an ungainly spider, I climbed down the cliff, my staff swinging from my belt. Rhea and Bumblebee were sprawled below me on the ledge, moaning painfully. The jester's bell-draped hat lay beside him, covered with red dust. Rhea tried to sit up, then fell back, her right arm dangling at her side. Working my way across the narrow ledge, I reached her at last. As I helped her sit up, she gasped when I brushed against her twisted arm. Her eyes, full of pain, searched my face. "You warned me. Just in time." I wished it had been a few seconds sooner. A sudden flurry of wind sprayed us with dust from the cliff wall. After it subsided, I took a pinch of herbs from my satchel and dabbed the scratch on her cheek. "How did you know it was a wraith?" "The webbed feet. Remember when we found that Aaliyah bird in the forest? That was when you showed me that shifting wraiths always have something odd about them." I indicated myself. A lot like people, I suppose. Rhea tried to lift her arm and winced painfully. "Most people aren't that dangerous." Moving carefully on the ledge, I came around to her other side to get a better view of the wounded arm. "It looks broken."
"And let's forget about poor old Bumblebee," the jester whimpered. "I did nothing useful. Nothing at all."
Despite her pain, Rhea almost grinned.
Bumblebee, you were wonderful. If my arm weren't ready to fall off, I'd give you a hug.
If only for a moment, the dour jester stopped moaning. He blushed ever so slightly. Then, seeing her injured arm, he frowned with his brow, cheeks, and chins.
That looks rather bad. You'll be incapacitated for life, never able to eat or sleep again.
I don't think so. Gently, I laid the arm across Rhea's lap, feeling for the break. She winced.
What can you do? There's nothing, that hurts, around here to use for a splint. And without two arms, it's going to be impossible climbing out of here.
Impossible,
echoed Bumblebee. I shook my head, knocking some pebbles from my hair. Nothing is impossible.
Bumblebee's right, protested Rhea. You can't fix this. Even that satchel of herbs can't help. Merlin, you should leave me here. Go on without me.
My jaw clenched. Absolutely not. I've learned more about binding than that. We are together, you and I, like those two hawks on the wind. A frail light flickered in her eyes.
But how? I can't climb without my arm.
I stretched my sore shoulders, then drew in a deep breath. I'm hoping to mend your arm.
Don't be ridiculous.
Bumblebee crept closer on the ledge.
To do that you'd need a splint, a stretcher, and an army of healers. It's impossible, I say.
Feeling the break, I placed my hands gently on top of it. Although it made no difference to my second sight, I closed my eyes in concentration. With all my power, I imagined light, warm and healing, gathering within my chest. As my heart brimmed with the light, I allowed it to flow down my arms and into my fingers. Like invisible rivers of warmth, the light flowed out of me and into Rhea.
Oh,
she sighed.
That feels good. What are you doing?
I'm just doing what a wise friend once told me to do, listening to the language of the wound. She smiled, leaning back against the rocky ledge.
Don't be fooled, warned Bumblebee. If you feel better now, it's only because you're going to feel 10 times worse later on.
I don't care, you old bother. It feels stronger already.
She started to lift her arm. Don't, I ordered. Not yet. As the warm light continued to pour out of my fingertips, I concentrated on the bones and muscles beneath her skin. Patiently, carefully, I felt each strand of tissue with my mind. Each strand I touched with gentleness, coaxing it to be strong again, to be whole again. One by one, I bathed the sinews, smoothed them, and knitted them back into place. Finally, I removed my hands. Rhea raised her arm. She wiggled her fingers. Then she flung her arms around my neck, squeezing with all the strength of a bear.
How did you do that?
She asked as she released me. I really don't know. I tapped the knotted top of my staff. But I think it might be another verse in the Song of Binding. She released me.
You have truly found the soul of that song. Your mother, the healer, would be proud.
Her words jolted me. Come, we have less than a week left. I want to get to the Slantos village by tomorrow morning. Chapter 21. The Shriek. By the time we finally pulled ourselves over the rim of the canyon, the sun had just set. Shadows gathered on the sheer buttresses, while the dark hills rising before us looked almost black. As I gazed at the hills, the lonely cry of a canyon eagle echoed somewhere nearby, reminding me of the eagle's cry that had begun the great council of Finkyra, and of the fact that those hills would have been restored to life by now had I kept my promise with the flowering harp. The three of us trekked in deepening dusk. The flat rocks under our feet quickly turned into dry, flaky soil, the kind of soil that I had learned to identify with the dark hills. But for the occasional rustling of leaves from withered trees, we heard only the crunching of our boots, the rattling of Bumblewee's bells, and the rhythmic punching of my staff on the ground. Darkness pressed closer. I knew that whatever brave animals might have returned to these hills since the collapse of the shrouded castle must have found secure places to hide after sundown, for that was the time when the warrior goblins and shifting wraiths, and whatever other creatures lived beneath the surface, might be tempted to emerge from their caves in the rock outcroppings and crevices. I shuddered, remembering that at least one such creature had dared to appear in broad daylight. Rhea, uncannily aware of my feelings as usual, gave my arm a gentle squeeze. Night fell as we continued to ascend the dark hills. Twisted trees stood like skeletons, their branches rattling in the wind. Staying on our northeasterly course was made more difficult because heavy clouds obscured most of the stars and the remaining moon. Even Rhea walked more slowly in the gloom. Although Bumblebee didn't complain openly, his mutterings grew increasingly fearful. My own weary legs tripped often over stones and dead roots. At this rate, we were more likely to get lost than attacked. When at last Rhea pointed out a narrow gully running down the slope, all that remained of a once surging stream, I agreed that it would be wise to rest there until dawn. Minutes later, the three of us lay on the hard soil of the ravine. Rhea found a rounded rock she could use as a pillow, while Bumblebee curled himself into a ball, declaring,
"I could sleep through an erupting volcano."
Given the danger, I tried my best to stay awake, but was soon slumbering along with the others. A high-pitched shriek rang out. I sat up, fully awake, as did Rhea beside me. Both of us held our breath, listening, but heard nothing beyond Bumblebee's snoring. A feeble glow behind the clouds was all that we could trace of the moon, and its light barely brushed the surrounding hills. The shriek came again. It hung in the air, a cry of sheer terror. Although Rhea tried to stop me, I grabbed my staff and stumbled out of the gully. She followed me onto the darkened slope. Searching the shadows, I stretched my second sight as far as I could, trying to detect any movement at all. Yet nothing stirred, not even a cricket. Suddenly, I spotted a hulking figure traversing the rocks below us. Even if I had not glimpsed the pointed helmet, I would have known instantly what it was. A warrior goblin. Over the goblin's muscular shoulder writhed a small, struggling creature whose life was clearly about to end. Without pausing to think, I dashed down the slope. Hearing my footsteps, the goblin whirled around. He tossed aside the prey on his shoulder and, with amazing speed, drew his broadsword. As he raised it over his head, his fiery eyes narrowed with rage. Weaponless except for my staff, I planted my feet and hurled myself straight at him. My shoulder crashed into his armored chest, throwing him backward. Together, we rolled and bounced down the rock-strewn slope. I came to a stop, my head still whirling, but the warrior goblin had recovered faster. He stood over me, snarling, his three-fingered hand still grasping the sword. As the moon above us broke out of the clouds, the blade gleamed darkly. Just as he brought down the sword, I rolled to one side. It slammed into the ground, splintering an old root. The warrior goblin growled wrathfully. He raised the sword again. I tried to stand, but tripped on a gnarled stick. My staff! In desperation, I lifted it to shield my face, even as the goblin's sword came slicing toward me. I knew the thin shaft would hardly slow the blade at all, yet I could do nothing more. As the blade struck the wood, a sudden explosion rocked the slope. A tower of blue flames soared high into the sky. The goblin's sword lifted with it, spinning like a branch borne aloft by a gale. The warrior goblin himself roared in anguish. He stumbled backward, collapsing on the hillside. He wheezed once, tried to raise himself, then fell back, as still as stone. Rhea ran to me. "Merlin, are you hurt?" "No." I rubbed the shaft, feeling the slight indentation where the sword had struck it. Thanks to this staff, and whatever virtue Tuatha gave to it. Rhea kneeled, her curls frosted with moonlight. I think it was as much you as the staff. I shook my head, observing the motionless form of the warrior goblin. Come now, Rhea, you know better. I do, she declared crisply. And I think you are denying it because you want so much for it to be true. Stunned, I gazed at her. You read me in the same way I came to read those runes on our boss's walls. Her bell-like laughter rang out. Some things I still can't understand, though. Like why, instead of hiding when you saw the goblin, you charged straight at him. Before I could reply, a small voice spoke behind us. You must be magical. Rhea and I spun around to see a short, round-faced boy crouching on the ground. He couldn't have been older than 5. I knew at once that he was the unfortunate creature whose shriek had awakened us. His eyes, themselves glowing like little moons, seemed full of awe. I glanced at Rhea. That's why. Turning back to the boy, I beckoned, Come here, I won't hurt you. Slowly he rose to his feet. Hesitantly he approached, then stopped himself. Are you good magical or bad magical? Rhea stifled a laugh, wrapping her leafy arms around the boy. He is very good magical, except when he's being very bad. As I growled playfully at her, the boy frowned in confusion. He wriggled away from Rhea and started backing down the shadowy slope. Don't listen to her. I am an enemy of warrior goblins, just like you. Leaning on my staff, I stood. My name is Merlin. This is Rhea, who comes from Druma Wood. Now, tell us your name. The boy studied me, patting his round cheek thoughtfully. You must be good magical to slay the goblin with only your staff. He sucked in his breath. I am Golwee, and I've lived all my life in the same village. I cocked my head. The only village near here is Slantos, finished the little fellow. My heart raced. Golwee looked away sheepishly. I didn't mean to stay outside the gates after dark. Really, I didn't. It's just that those squirrels were playing, and I followed them, and when I realized how late it was... He glared at the twisted form of the fallen warrior goblin. He wanted to hurt me. I stepped to the small boy's side. He won't hurt you now. Eyes shining, he tilted his head to look up at me. I think you really are good magical. Chapter 22. Ambrosia Bread. When we returned to the ravine, we found Bumblebee still snoring. Although the explosion of flame had not been a volcano, his prediction of sleeping soundly had certainly proved true. Rhea and I carefully tucked Golwee, who was so tired he could barely stand, under a portion of the jester's cloak. Then, feeling our own exhaustion, we joined them on the ground. Clutching my staff, I soon fell asleep. Before long, the first fingers of morning light tickled my face. I woke to find Bumblebee already doing his best to impress young Golwee with his skills as a jester. From the solemn expression on the boy's round face, I could tell he hadn't progressed very far.
That is why, the dour fellow was explaining, they call me Bumblebee the Mirthful.
Golwee stared at him, looking as if he were about to cry.
Let me show you another of my jesterly talents.
Bumblebee gave his head a vigorous shake, clanging his bells, and drew his cloak tightly about him.
I will now tell you the famous riddle of the bells.
Rhea, who was also watching, started to protest, but I held up my hand. Let's hear this confounded riddle. We've been hearing about it for weeks. She smirked. I suppose so. Are you ready to eat your boots if any of us laugh? Ready. I licked my lips in mock satisfaction. Then, with any luck, we'll find something more tasty at the Slantos village. Bumblebee cleared his throat, making his drooping chins quiver.
I am now ready, he announced.
He paused expectantly, almost as if he could not quite believe that he was finally being allowed to tell his riddle. We're waiting, I declared, but not all day. The jester's wide mouth opened, then shut. Opened again, shut again. I leaned forward. Well? Bumblebee's eyebrows arched in consternation. He cleared his throat once more. He stomped his foot on the dry ground, rattling his bells again. But he did not speak. Are you going to tell this riddle of yours or not? The jester bit his lip, then shook his head glumly.
It's been so long, he grumbled. So many people over so many years have stopped me from telling it. Now that I may, I can't remember it.
He heaved a sigh.
Too true, too true, too true.
As Rhea and I rolled our eyes, Galway smiled broadly. He turned to me.
Could you take me back to the village now, with you? I feel safe.
I tapped Bumblebee's hunched shoulder. Perhaps one day you'll remember it.
If that ever happens, he replied, I'll probably botch the delivery.
Moments later, we were trekking toward the rising sun. As usual, Rhea and I led the way, although now I bore Galway on my shoulders. Bumblebee, more somber than ever, kept to the rear. To my relief, we soon began a long, rolling descent, leaving behind the parched slopes and shadowed rock outcroppings of the dark hills. I could not rid myself of the uneasy feeling that the goblin we had encountered was only one of the first of Rita Gower's warriors to emerge from hiding. Nor could I forget how little I had done to make this land habitable for other creatures. Before long, we entered a wide, grassy plain. Piping birds and humming insects appeared as clusters of trees with hand-shaped leaves grew more common. A family of foxes, bushy tails all erect, crossed our trail. Sitting in the boughs of a willow tree sat a wide-eyed squirrel who reminded me of Rhea's friend Ixtma, and of the dying woman in his care. The first sign of the village was the smell. Grounded in the rich, hearty aroma of roasting grains, the smell strengthened as we crossed the grassy plain. With every step it intensified, reminding me of how long it had been since I had eaten a crust of freshly baked bread. I could almost taste the grains. Wheat, corn, barley. Other aromas, too, wove through this fragrant fabric. Something tangy, like the bright orange fruits that Rhea and I devoured long ago beneath the boughs of the Shamora tree. Something sharp and fresh, like the crushed mint that Helene often added to her tea. Something sweet, like the honey that bees made from clover blossoms. And more, much more. The smell contained spicy flavors, robust flavors, and soothing flavors as well. It also contained, more often than not, a hint of something that was not really a flavor at all, more like a feeling, an attitude, even an idea. When at last we entered the valley of the Slantos, and their low, brown buildings came into view, the smell grew overpowering. My mouth watering, I remembered tasting the Slantos bread once before, in the underground den of Cairpray. What had he called it? Ambrosia bread. Food for the gods, the Greeks would have surely agreed. I remembered biting into the stiff crust, as hard as wood at first. Then, after some vigorous chewing, the bread had exploded with zesty flavor. A wave of nourishment had coursed through me, making me feel taller and sturdier. For a moment, I had even forgotten about the perpetual soreness between my shoulder blades. Then I remembered something else. Cairpray, through a mouthful of ambrosia bread, had given me a stern warning. No one from other parts of Finkyra has ever tasted the Slantos' most special breads, and they guard those precious recipes with their lives. I gripped my staff as a new wave of fear surged through me. If the Slantos were not even willing to part with their recipes, how in the world was I going to get them to part with something much more valuable? The soul of the Song of Naming. At the sight of the village gates in the distance, Galway released a whoop of joy, jumped down from my shoulders, and scampered ahead of us, his arms flapping like the wings of a young bird. Beyond the gates, smoke poured from the hearths of many low buildings. The structures, while varied sizes, were all made from wide brown bricks lined with yellow mortar. I almost smiled, noting that they looked like giant loaves of buttered bread themselves. Bumblebee, who had remained silent all morning, smacked his lips.
Do you think they're in the habit of giving visitors a crust of bread? Or do they turn people away hungry?
My guess, answered Rhea, is that they're not in the habit of having visitors at all. The only people on this side of Eagle's Canyon are in...
Abruptly she caught herself, glancing at me. In prison, in the caverns south of here, you were about to say. I pushed some stray black hairs off my face. Like Stangmar, the man who was once my father. Rhea eyed me sympathetically.
He's still your father.
I strode more briskly toward the gates. Not any more. I don't have a father. She swallowed.
I know how you feel. I never even knew my father, or my mother.
At least you have our Barsa, and the rest of Druma Wood. As you've said before, that's your real family. She worked her tongue, but said nothing. As we arrived at the wooden gates, which were affixed to two tremendous spruce trees, a guard stepped out of the shadows by one of the trunks. Shaking the thinning locks of sand-colored hair that fell over his ears, he scowled at each of us in turn. Though his sword remained in its scabbard, one of his hands grasped the hilt. Even more than the roasting grains that filled the air, I began to smell the likelihood of trouble. Warily, he examined my staff.
Be that the magical staff that felled the goblin?
I blinked in surprise. You know about that already?
Half the village knows by now, snorted the guard. Young Master Galway has been telling everyone he can find.
You'll let us pass, then? The guard shook his locks again.
I didn't say that.
He pointed at the staff, eyeing it cautiously.
How do I know you won't use that to harm any villagers?
Well, for the same reason I'm not using it to harm you right now. His face tightened, and he gave his sword an anxious tug.
You'll have to do better than that. You could be an infiltrator after our secrets, or an errand boy for the goblins, for all I know.
Rhea, bristling, stepped forward.
Then why would he have slain the goblin last night?
As a ruse, leafy girl.
He ran a hand through his thinning hair.
Tell me then, why would a boy, a girl, and a...
He paused, observing Bumblebee.
And a beggar of whatever kind travel all the way to Slantos? Not by chance, I'll wager.
No, I answered carefully. Your village is famous, far and near, for its breads. My friends and I would like to learn some of the bread-maker's art. His eyes bored into me.
I suspect that's not all you'd like to learn.
Remembering Carepray's warning, I swallowed. I seek nothing that won't be given freely. The guard lifted his face to the spruce boughs above him, as if somehow seeking their counsel. He drew a long, slow breath.
Well, all right. I shall let you in. Not for what you've said, which leaves me quite suspicious, I'll tell you, but for what you did to help Master Galway.
With a final shake of his dangling hair, he moved aside, stepping into the shadows under one of the trees. Although I could feel his eyes watching me warily, I didn't look back again, nor did the others. Immediately upon stepping through the gates, I spotted a high, spiraling structure in the middle of the common. Children squealed and jumped, playing around its base, while a steady stream of adults shuttled to and from it. Laden with buckets, baskets, and jugs, they resembled a colony of ants, hauling all the burdens of their society on their backs. Then I noticed a strange rippling on the gold-colored surface of the structure, as if it were moving somehow, as if it were alive. Except for the few who pointed to my staff, whispering furtively, most of the villagers seemed too preoccupied with their tasks to pay any attention to us. Stepping over a cluster of children playing some sort of game with sticks, I moved cautiously closer to the structure. It seemed to be the source of at least some of the delicious smell that emanated from this village, and its surface was indeed moving. A thick golden liquid flowed slowly from a spout at its highest point, down several spiraling troughs, all the way to a wide pool at its base. Out of this pool, people labored to draw the golden liquid by the bucketful, which they carried briskly into the buildings. At the same time, other people poured flour, milk, and other ingredients into the many vents that ringed the base. A fountain, I stared, utterly amazed. A fountain of bread. Dough, you mean? Rhea bent over the churning pool. They must use the golden stuff. Doesn't it remind you of honey, but thicker, as dough to start some of their breads?
All of our breads, in fact.
We whirled around to see a plump, fair-haired man with ruddy cheeks who was filling 2 large pitchers from the fountain. His ears, like other Finkirons, were slightly pointed at the top. Yet his voice, like his face, seemed quite unusual, both scornful and mirthful at once. He was, I felt sure, one or the other. Which one I could not tell. When the pitchers had nearly overflowed, he pulled them out of the pool. Resting them on his sizable belly, he observed us for a moment.
Visitors, eh? We don't like visitors.
Unsure whether he was being unfriendly or merely playful, I spoke up. I would like to learn a little about bread baking. Could you help me?
Could,
he answered gruffly, or teasingly.
But I'm too busy now.
He started to walk away.
Try some other day.
I don't have another day. I ran over to his side, keeping with him as he strode toward one of the buildings. Won't you please show me a little of your art?
No, he declared. I told you,
He tripped, tumbling over 2 scruffy boys about the same age as Galwee, who were fighting over a loaf of blue-speckled bread. While only one of the pitchers fell to the ground, it smashed into dozens of pieces, all oozing with golden liquid from the fountain.
Now see what you've done.
With a growl that was clearly serious, not playful, he stooped down to gather the broken pieces. Seeing me start to assist, he waved me away angrily.
Go away, boy. I don't need your help.
Glumly, I turned back to the bread fountain. I trudged toward it, barely noticing the rich aromas it continued to spill into the air. Rhea, having seen what happened, shook her head in dismay. She knew, as did I, that all of our efforts up to this point would be worthless unless we could find what we needed here in Slantos. As I passed the 2 squabbling boys, who looked like twin brothers, I could tell that their argument was about to explode into a full-scale fight. Fists clenched, voices snarled. One boy tried to step on the blue-speckled loaf, which lay at the other one's feet. The second boy's nostrils flared. He roared angrily and charged at his enemy. Slipping my staff through my belt, I stepped between them. Holding one boy by the collar of his tunic and the other by the shoulder, I tried my best to keep them apart. Both shouted and struggled against me, kicking wildly at my legs. Finally, when my arms were about to give out, I released them and quickly snatched up the loaf of bread. I raised the loaf, now more dirty brown than blue. "Is this what you're fighting about?" "It's mine!" cried one. "No, mine!" shouted the other. Both of them lunged at the bread, but I held it just out of reach of their grasping hands. Ignoring their angry squeals, I waved it above them. Still warm, it smelled of sweet molasses. "Now," I demanded, "would you like to know how you can both have some?" One boy cocked his head skeptically. "How?" I glanced furtively over my shoulder. "I can tell you, but only on the condition that you keep it a secret." The boys considered the idea, then nodded their heads in unison. I kneeled down, then whispered something to them. Eyes wide, they listened intently. Finally, when I had finished, I handed them the loaf. They sat down on the spot, and within seconds both of their mouths were bulging with bread.
"Not bad."
I looked up to find the plump man gazing at me.
"Tell me, boy, how did you ever get them to share the loaf?"
Standing up, I pulled my staff from my belt. Simple, really. I merely suggested that each take turns having a bite. I grinned slightly. And I also told them that if they couldn't manage that, I would eat the bread myself. The man released a deep guttural sound that could have been either a laugh or a groan. Scrunching up his face, he appeared to regard me with new respect. Or new concern. It was hard to tell. At last he spoke, removing any doubt.
"If you'd like to learn a little about bread baking, boy, follow me."
Chapter 23. Naming. The man strode to one of the loaf-shaped buildings at the far edge of the common. Before entering, he tossed the fragments of his broken pitcher into a pail outside the door. Then he wiped his plump hand on his tan tunic, already stained by many other wipings. Laying his hand on the wall by the door, he gave the brown bricks a grateful tap.
"Ever seen bricks like this?"
"No. Are they made from a special kind of mud?" His expression turned grumpy. Or amused.
"Actually, they're made from a special kind of flour. The ingredients give it unusual hardness, you see."
He tapped the bricks again.
"Knowing your ingredients, boy, is the first principle of baking bread."
Something about how he said, "knowing your ingredients," made me think that he meant something more than merely recognizing different grains and herbs. Tempted though I was to ask him to explain, I held my tongue for fear of pushing too hard.
"This one," he continued, "wheat loaf, baked 6 times for extra strength."
He pressed his stubby fingers against the wall.
"These bricks will outlive me by 100 years."
Rhea, who had followed us, gazed at the bricks in wonder. "I've eaten some hard bread before, but not that hard." The rotund man turned to her. Suddenly he started to laugh, so hard that his belly shook, and golden liquid sloshed out of his remaining pitcher.
"Good one, Forest Girl."
She smiled. "You may call me Rhea." "And me Merlin." The man nodded.
"And me, Pluton."
"Pluton," I repeated. "Isn't that a Greek name? From the story of Demeter and the first harvest of corn?"
"Why, yes, boy. How do you come to know about the Greeks?"
My throat went dry. "My mother taught me."
"Indeed, as did mine. No child is born in Slantos who doesn't learn the tales of harvesting and baking from many different lands, and it's not unusual to give a child a name from one of those tales."
He gave me an ambiguous look.
"Of course, that's not my true name."
Rhea and I traded glances. Remembering Ronaldo's comment about true names, I felt tempted to ask more. Besides, it troubled me that I could see no connection between the domestic art of bread baking and the magical art of naming, but I held back. Things had taken a positive turn, and I did not want to alter that. Better to wait for another moment to learn about naming. Pluton lifted the door latch.
"Come on in, both of you."
As we started to follow him inside, I suddenly remembered Bumblebee. Scanning the bustling common, I quickly found him, still standing by the bread fountain. He was leaning against its base, peering hungrily at the pool of golden liquid. Children, probably curious about his belled hat, were gathering around him. He seemed unlikely to get into any trouble, and I didn't want to stretch Pluton's hospitality any further than necessary, so I decided just to leave him there. As we entered the building, a new wave of aromas washed over us. I smelled roasting barley, some nectar as sweet as roses in bloom, and several spices I could not identify. The main room looked like the kitchen of a bustling inn, with pots boiling on the hearth, dried herbs and roots and bark shavings dangling from the ceiling, and bags of grain and flour sitting on the shelves. The room held 6 or 7 people busily stirring, pouring, slicing, mixing, testing and baking. From their expressions it was clear that they both enjoyed their work and took it quite seriously. Sunlight streamed into the room through rows of narrow windows, yet the main source of light was the hearth itself, a complex of stone ovens and fire pits that covered almost an entire wall. Rather than burning wood, the hearth's fires used some sort of flat grey cakes as fuel. No doubt they came from another mysterious recipe of the Slantos. Above the hearth, high enough to be well out of reach, hung a massive sword, its hilt blackened by many years of fires beneath it. The metal scabbard had rusted with age, the leather belt had been eaten away. Something about the old sword made me curious to examine it more closely, yet with the swirl of activity in the room, I soon forgot about it. A tall girl, with apple cheeks and black hair that fell to her shoulders, approached Pluton. She looked quite different from anyone else I had seen in the village, partly because of her dark hair, partly because of her slender form. Her eyes, as black as my own, glowed with intelligence. The girl reached for the pitcher of golden liquid, then froze when she noticed Rhea and me standing to the side. Pluton flicked his hand toward us.
"This is Merlin and Rhea. They're here to learn a bit about baking."
Indicating the girl, he added brusquely, or just distractedly,
"This is my apprentice, Vivian. Came to me when her parents, whom I'd known from my travels in the south, died in a terrible flood. How long ago was that now?"
6 years, Breadmaster Pluton." She took the pitcher, her hands embracing it with the care of a mother holding a newborn. Still watching us warily, she asked, "Are you not concerned about them?"
"Concerned? My, yes."
He studied her inscrutably.
"But no more concerned than I was about you."
She stiffened, but stayed silent.
"Besides," Pluton continued, "I heard a story in the common about a boy who beat off a huge warrior goblin with nothing more than his staff. Saved one of our own children, he did."
He cocked his head toward me.
"Might that have been you?"
A bit embarrassed, I nodded. He waved his stout hand at my staff.
"And might that have been your weapon?"
Again I nodded.
"Not much of one against a goblin," he said casually. "Unless, of course, it's touched by magic."
At that, Vivian caught her breath, her cold dark eyes fixed on my staff. Instinctively, I turned the shaft around so that the markings from the songs faced the other way. Pluton reached out and took a steaming loaf of yellow-crusted bread from the tray of the man walking past. Breaking it into 2 halves, he filled his lungs with the freshly roasted smell. Then he handed the halves to Rhea and me.
"Eat now,"
he suggested, or commanded.
"You'll need your strength."
Without any hesitation, both of us bit into the crusts. As the warm, chewy bread touched our tongues, tasting of corn and butter and dill and many things more, our gazes met. Rhea's eyes sparkled, like the ocean sky at sunrise. Pluton turned to Vivian.
"We'll keep them to the simplest tasks. Stirring, mixing, slicing. No recipes."
He picked up a pair of wooden buckets, dusted with flour, and handed them to Rhea.
"You can fill these, one with barley and one with wheat, from those sacks over there. Then carry them to the grinding wheel in that room beyond the high shelves. You can learn a bit about milling and sifting in there.
He brushed some flour off his tunic.
And you, boy, can do some chopping. Over there at the table preparing hot bread.
Vivian seemed startled. Really, bread master?
That's right,
declared Pluton.
He can chop some seeds.
Ignoring her look of surprise, he turned to me.
If you do a good job, boy, I'll show you more. Might even let you taste a little hot bread itself, which will fill your belly even as it fills your heart with courage.
Swallowing the remains of my crust, I said, "Thank you, but I need no bread beyond what you just gave me. It's delicious." His round face glowed.
As I said, it all comes from knowing your ingredients.
A secretive smile touched his lips, then vanished.
You'll need a chopping knife for the seeds, and we're quite short on them right now. Ah, good, there's one left at the table. Vivian, why don't you take him over there and show him how it's done? I'll come by to check on his progress shortly.
Hearing this, the girl brightened. Smoothly, she stepped between Rhea and me. In a voice far gentler than before, she whispered to me, "Most people call me Vivian, but my friends call me Nimue." A warm smile graced her apple cheeks. "I'll be glad to help you, any way I can." Thank you, Nimue," I mumbled. Was I merely flattered by her attention, or was there something else about this girl that made my heart beat faster? Rhea, the light gone from her eyes, nudged her aside. "You can start by getting him a knife." She shot me a harsh look of warning. Her intrusion annoyed me. What did I need to be warned about anyway? She was treating me like a child again. "Come," said Nimue, brushing past Rhea. Gently taking my hand, she slowly slid her fingers up the length of my forearm. A new warmth filled me as she led me over to a table covered with vegetables, seeds, roots, and herbs. An elderly woman sat at one end of the table, deftly sorting the ingredients into piles. At the other end stood a young man, thinly bearded, peeling the skin off an enormous nut that looked like a giant acorn. "Let's start here." Nimue guided me to the middle of the table. She slid over a bowl containing a stack of square, purple vegetables, steaming from having just been cooked. Pulling a battered knife from a block of wood on the table, she deftly sliced open the vegetable and removed a flat seed that glowed with a deep red luster. Then, laying her warm hand over my own, she showed me the sharp, twisting motion that would allow me to chop the seed into tiny pieces. "There now," she said kindly, allowing her hand to linger on mine. "You are most fortunate, you know. Hard bread is one of Breadmaster Pluton's great specialties. He hardly ever lets an outsider help prepare it, certainly not chop the essential seeds." She flashed her most lovely smile. "He must see something special in you." With a slight squeeze, she lifted her hand. "I'll come back to check on you in a while." As she started to step away, she pointed to my staff, propped against the side of the table. "That staff of yours is going to fall. Should I put it somewhere safe for you?" A vague shiver ran through me, though I wasn't sure why. After all, she was only trying to be helpful. "No, thank you," I replied. "It's fine where it is." "Oh, but I wouldn't want it to get damaged. It's so very handsome." She reached out to touch it. Just then the elderly woman happened to bump her knee against the table. The staff slid sideways along the edge, falling against my hip. I grasped it by the shaft and slid it into the belt of my tunic. "There," I said to Nimue. "It's safe now." For the briefest instant, her eyes seemed to flash with anger, though the look of kindness returned so swiftly that I couldn't be sure. In any case, she quickly turned and walked away. After a few paces, she looked back, smiling warmly. I could not help but smile in return. Then I turned back to the table and took one of the purple vegetables. Still steaming, it sliced open easily. Carefully, I removed the lustrous seed. As I started to chop it, however, the worn blade suddenly split into shards. Rotten luck! I cast aside the useless knife. I needed to perform my task well, not to bungle it. Pluton, I felt sure, was testing me. Why else would he have given me such unusual responsibility? He had even promised to show me more, if only I did my job well. And if I failed, I couldn't possibly gain his trust. Frantically, I cast about with my second sight, searching for another blade that I could use. Nothing. Every single knife in the room was being used by someone for carving or slicing. I rose, still carrying my staff in my belt, and looked again. On the shelves, by the hearth, under the tables. Nothing. No blade of any kind. Then my gaze fell on the tarnished sword hanging above the hearth. It would be clumsy to wield and grimy to hold, but it was at least a blade. No, I told myself, the idea was ridiculous. I had never seen anyone use a sword for chopping. I chewed my lip, searching the room again. No knives anywhere, and time was wasting. Pluton would be checking on my progress soon. I turned again to the grimy blade. Spying a small ladder leaning against the tallest set of shelves, I placed it next to the hearth. Climbing up to its top rung, I reached as high as I could. Yet I couldn't quite reach the hilt of the sword. I looked around for someone taller who might be able to help, but all the people in the room were deeply immersed in their own tasks. Standing on tiptoes, I tried again. Almost there. I stretched even higher. Almost. But no, I simply could not reach it. I glared at the sword, cursing to myself. Why had it been placed so high anyway? To be of any help, it needed to be reachable, and I could certainly use its help now, not just for chopping the seeds for heartbread. Much more was at stake. If I couldn't win over Pluton, I couldn't possibly save Hélène. I concentrated on the old sword, searching for some way to reach it. If only I could make it fly to me, as I had done long ago with deeper cut. But, as Unalda had taught me, that had been possible only because of deeper cut's own magic. At that instant, I noticed some very faint scratches on the hilt. They could be nothing but random marks, or perhaps they could be something more. Runes, letters. Could this sword, like deeper cut, possess some sort of magic? Yet even as the thought struck me, I knew that the chances were extremely small. Why would a magical sword be hanging rusted and unused in a remote village devoted to baking bread? Still, the runes seemed to beckon me. Perhaps they described the sword's history, or, if indeed it were magical, perhaps they gave instructions on how to use it, how to make it fly to me. Straining to focus my second sight, I tried to make some sense of the scratches. Beneath the layers of dust and soot, I detected a rhythm, a pattern to the marks. There were straight lines, and curves, and corners. Throwing all my power into the task, I followed the hidden indentations. The first letter came clear. I could read it. Then the second, and the third, the fourth, the fifth, all the way to the end of the word. For that was all the hilt contained, a single unusual word. I spoke the word, not out loud, but within the walls of my mind, pronounced it slowly, carefully, savoring the richness of the name. And, in return, the sword spoke to me. It declared its grand past, and its even grander future. I am the sword of light, past and present. I am the sword of kings, once and future. Suddenly, the sword detached itself from the wall. At the same time, all the grime vanished from the hilt, revealing the brilliant silver forged beneath. Scabbard and belt were reborn, transformed into polished metal and sturdy leather, studded with purple gemstones. As gracefully as a leaf borne aloft by the wind, the sword floated over the hearth and into my hands. Only then did I realize that the entire room had fallen silent. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were trained on me. My heart sank, for I felt certain I would now be labeled an infiltrator. Rhea and I would be banished, or worse. Pluton, looking either annoyed or astonished, stepped forward. Hands on his wide hips, he regarded me for a while.
"Didn't think much of you at first, that's certain."
I'm sorry about your sword." He ignored me, continuing his thought.
"Still, like a good lump of dough, you have risen, boy. Beyond anything I ever expected.